Chapter 2807. Under such circumstances, the only way for Luo Fan to ascertain everything was to personally come into contact with it. With that in mind, Luo Fan put aside the possibility of space, time, world, and heaven and earth that might exist on the surface. Although he was quite interested in all of these and had a lot of exploration. However, in comparison, the essence of the power before him was much more attractive. If he could easily see the space-time, world, and heaven and earth that might exist on the surface, he would naturally not be stingy with this bit of time to observe and comprehend those space-time, world, and heaven and earth. However, it was clear that this was not the case. The amount of time and energy needed to find those space-time, worlds, and heaven and earth would probably be beyond imagination. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan naturally wouldn't waste any more time on this. With a slight movement in his heart, Luo Fan sent his perception into the power in front of him, going deeper into the depths of that power. If it was an ordinary power, he would be able to understand most of its properties with just a glance, let alone a sweep of his perception. However, it was obvious that the power that appeared in front of Luo Fan was no ordinary power. In the face of such power, Luo Fan's perception seemed so powerless. In fact, his perception didn't even have the ability to penetrate that power. That power didn't seem to have any effect on his perception, as if his perception could penetrate it with just a little bit of force. However, this gap seemed to exist forever. No matter how much force he used, it was still a gap. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan couldn't help but frown deeply. His perception had no effect on this power, which clearly meant that he could only use other, more complicated methods to gain a deeper understanding of this power. Sighing, he could only prepare to withdraw his perception. However, his expression quickly changed again, because he noticed to his shock that his senses seemed to have been completely glued to that energy. No matter how much he withdrew his perception, it was still tightly glued to that power. It was still in that strange state where it was about to penetrate into that power but was still a little short. This situation was the complete opposite of when he wanted to use his perception to seep into that power earlier. Are they entangled? Luo Fan's frown deepened. His movement of withdrawing his perception was not hindered in the slightest. However much of it was withdrawn, the same amount returned to his body. There was not the slightest omission, and there was not the slightest strange consumption of his perception. But no matter how much perception he withdrew, there was still a portion that belonged to him that wanted to come in contact with that power. It was as if his perception was constantly being born. Very quickly, the amount of perception he withdrew had already exceeded the amount he had released in an attempt to explore that power. These extra senses were no different from his own. At the very least, Luo Fan could not feel the difference between the two. The continuous influx of these perceptions naturally made Luo Fan feel an inexplicable pleasure of being strengthened in the beginning. He even felt that his perception of everything in the outside world was improving at every moment. However, very soon, when this perception increased to a certain extent, he felt an indescribable pressure gradually emerging. One must know that perception was an abstract existence derived from a living being's own spirit, will, life essence, mind, and other related existences. This abstract existence could be said to be a bridge connecting the outside world and many related existences. Widening the bridge was naturally a good thing in the beginning. It could make the communication between the two ends smoother and more convenient. However, if there was no limit to the widening of the bridge, the result would obviously be completely different. Once the bridge was widened to a certain extent, the boundary between the two ends of the bridge would gradually be blurred. It was just like building a bridge on a river. If the bridge was too wide and even covered a large part of the river, then the two sides of the river would obviously be difficult to distinguish. The two sides would be integrated into one area, a wider area that completely encompassed the characteristics of both sides of the river. For the whole, this situation might be considered a good thing. After all, it could unify the originally scattered areas. However, for the areas on both sides of the river, this outcome was obviously quite tragic. Unifying the two sides seemed to be expanding the area on both sides of the river, making both sides more concise. However, for both sides of the river, wouldn't this be equivalent to completely erasing the meaning of their existence? If both sides were unified, how could there still be the concept of two sides? If it was Luo Fan, the situation would be the same. His perception was equivalent to that bridge, and the divine soul, mind, will, life essence, and other existences inside his body, which belonged to the category of his body, were equivalent to one end of that bridge. Everything outside his body was equivalent to the other end of the bridge. When the bridge was widened to a certain extent, it would be equivalent to completely breaking the boundary between the two sides, allowing the two to fuse, or rather, mix together. In this case, this was exactly what cultivators who walked a certain path of cultivation wanted. However, for Luo Fan, who had walked his own path of cultivation and used the nomological worldview as a foundation to improve himself, this situation was unacceptable to him. Hence, at this moment, while his perception was continuously strengthening, Luo Fan's body and mind were trying its best to resist this change and maintain its purity. It was precisely because of his resistance and struggle that he felt more and more pressure at this moment. I can't continue. Sensing the increasingly strong effect of confusion and assimilation appearing in his body and mind, Luo Fan confirmed that he had to change his response plan. Fortunately, although the force stuck to his perception, it did not attack him further. All the changes that made Luo Fan feel troublesome could actually be considered Luo Fan's own doing. Hence, at this moment, he just stopped moving, and everything came to a complete stop. His perception was still stuck to the force, but his figure and aura had become much better because of this. After a long while, when Luo Fan finally got rid of the enhanced perception and regained his balance, his entire body returned to its peak state. Only then did the indescribable pressure and chaos completely disappear. But what should I do next? After getting rid of the perception that didn't belong to him, Luo Fan couldn't help but feel at a loss. There was no doubt that he had to extract his perception from the force. He couldn't exist here forever, and his perception couldn't be stuck to the force forever. If he wanted to escape, he naturally had to break free from the force with his perception. Just when Luo Fan was slightly at a loss, countless shadows suddenly appeared out of thin air in a position not far away. These shadows were extremely strange. Every single shadow was different from each other. Furthermore, every single shadow was undergoing some sort of indescribable distortion and transformation, giving off an incomparably strange feeling. There really is space-time. At this moment, such a thought flashed in Luo Fan's mind when he saw this scene. The place where the shadows appeared clearly didn't have any physical existence. At the very least, there wasn't any physical existence that he could sense. However, there was suddenly such a strange shadow in such a place. This obviously showed that the place where he couldn't sense any physical existence was not as empty as he saw it to be. Coupled with his previous conjecture, he naturally knew that there was at least some kind of space-time there. Even the world, and even heaven and earth. This was the only reason why so many shadows appeared at this time. At this moment, a large portion of the countless shadows dissipated, and the remaining began to gather continuously, finally turning into the appearance of a strange creature. This strange creature's appearance did not fit Luo Fan's aesthetic standards at all. Even with his tolerance, he could only use the word monster to describe this creature's appearance. After the creature took shape, it tried its best to break free from the place where it was. At the moment it broke free, a soft sound was heard by Luo Fan. It was as if something indescribable had broken. I've finally ascended successfully. Ha ha. After a while, the monster began to laugh out loud, obviously extremely proud. As for the language it spoke, it was needless to say. To Luo Fan, he could instantly sense the intent attached to any language. Therefore, as long as there was an additional intent attached to the voice, even if it wasn't a real language, he could instantly understand it. Although the appearance of the monster in front of him did not fit Luo Fan's aesthetic standards, it was still a high-level intelligent creature, after all, and what it spoke was a language. Therefore, this kind of language was naturally not a problem for him at all. It could be said that at this moment, if Luo Fan was willing, he could already communicate with this monster at any time. However, being able to do it and knowing how to do it were two different things. Time was still quite tight at this moment. If he missed this opportunity, he would probably have to wait for a long time before he could find another one. An opportunity to explore the space-time, world, or heaven and earth that existed on the surface of that power. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth on the surface of his body naturally released an indescribable power, which instantly enveloped the monster. The monster was originally extremely proud of being able to ascend and become the only expert in its world to ascend for tens of thousands of years. Suddenly, it found that its entire body and even its perception had been completely restrained, and it could not even move. For a moment, it could not help but feel inexplicably terrified. Isn't this the immortal realm? Why would I be attacked like this after entering the immortal realm? The monster was inexplicably shocked, feeling that it had encountered an incomprehensible fantasy. At this moment, Luo Fan naturally did not have the mood to care about the doubts and resentment in the monster's heart. At this moment, he directly grasped the existence of some kind of karmic connection between the monster and this power. Obviously, it was not a simple matter to ascend from this world. Moreover, even if it could succeed, its connection with that world could not be completely severed just like that. At the very least, the karmic connection between the monster and the world could not be easily severed along with its ascension. At this moment, what Luo Fan valued was obviously the karmic connection between the monster and the world it had ascended from. This kind of karmic connection was extremely subtle. As long as a living being was born in that world, then this karmic connection would definitely exist. Unless a living being could transcend the karmic connection and consciously sever this connection completely, like an existence at the level of Luo Fan at this moment, for the monster, if it was given some time, it might be able to completely sever the karmic connection. However, it was obvious that at this moment, when it had just ascended and left the world it was born from, that world or even that space-time, the monster could not do this in time. Therefore, at this moment, although it had already left the place it was born from, there was still an extremely obvious karmic connection between it and that world. It was precisely because of the existence of this connection that Luo Fan could clearly sense the situation of the space-time, world, or heaven and earth that had a karmic connection with the monster through this connection. Of course, it could only be done at this moment before the monster reacted. Once the monster reacted and conveniently severed the karmic connection, he would obviously not have such a chance anymore. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan decisively suppressed the monster, rendering it unable to move, and even more so, unable to use any means to sever the karmic connection. After completely suppressing the monster, Luo Fan truly heaved a sigh of relief. With this foundation, he could truly sense the situation of the space-time, world, or heaven and earth that existed on the surface of the power in the outside world, and then deepen his understanding of the power through these various situations. At this moment, the monster finally reacted and roared furiously, "Who exactly are you?" The target of this roar was naturally Luo Fan. Chapter 28:08. As he spoke, Luo Fan had already clearly seen the world where the monster was born through the karma link. Or, to be more precise, it was not just a world, but a group of worlds. There were countless worlds there, and they formed a group of worlds in an extremely strange way. Every corner of this world was full of vitality and endless creatures were born, just like what Luo Fan had seen in the simulated state of chaos. In the real state of chaos, it was exactly the same as what he had seen in the Road of Tao Master and all other areas. Sure enough, looking at this scene, Luo Fan could not help but feel a little emotional. That was obviously just a very ordinary place on the surface of the power, and if one looked carefully, it was possible to find billions of similar places. However, it was such an ordinary place that had such a group of worlds. This was enough to show that Luo Fan's previous guess was correct. The surface of this power might indeed contain endless spacetime, endless worlds, and endless heaven and earth. For Luo Fan to know the existence of that group of worlds, the karma link on the monster was obviously no longer necessary. Immediately, he smiled at the monster and said, "Thank you for your help, friend. You can do as you please." As he spoke, his heart moved, and the power that was binding the monster was completely dispersed at this moment, so that the monster was no longer restricted at all. The monster was originally thinking about what Luo Fan meant, and even wondering if it should take advantage of the situation to cooperate. However, it did not expect that before it could react, the other party actually said that everything was over, and that his goal had been achieved. It was so sudden that it could not react for a moment. It was a little tongue-tied, but did not know what to say. However, it quickly reacted, and its expression became solemn as it asked, "What did you do?" As he spoke, he extended his perception towards the heaven and earth group that he had escaped from. Obviously, he wanted to know what Luo Fan had done to the heaven and earth group. After all, that heaven and earth group was his hometown. Even if he had already ascended and left, his hometown was still his hometown. Even the most stone-hearted existence would have different feelings for their hometown compared to other places. Whether it was positive or negative, it was obvious that the monster's feelings for his hometown were more positive at this time. How could he not be worried when he found out that Luo Fan might have used the karmic connection he had with his hometown to do something to his hometown? "Don't you feel it?" Luo Fan suddenly asked curiously. "Feel what? Did you really do something?" The monster couldn't help but panic. "No, I'm talking about your perception. Don't you feel that your perception is abnormal?" Luo Fan prompted. When the monster used its perception to explore the heaven and earth cluster that it had escaped from, its actions were extremely rough. Although its perception had entered the heaven and earth cluster, it had accomplished its original goal. But at the same time, a portion of his perception leaked out and covered the power below. In other words, its power was actually already the same as Luo Fan's. It had also come into contact with that power. However, Luo Fan was very clear about what would happen if he were to come into direct contact with that power. The monster was puzzled. What was wrong with his perception? His perception was very normal. What was there to care about? However, it also understood that an existence at Luo Fan's level obviously wouldn't do things without thinking. Since there was a problem, there might really be some kind of danger. At that moment it began to withdraw its perception. The moment it began to withdraw its perception, its expression changed drastically. Perception, it stuck to the bottom. The monster clearly did not know that the existence that its world was attached to was a force. To it, there was an even more unimaginable world beyond this world. To it, that force was merely the support of the lower layer of this unimaginable world. At that moment, it sensed what Luo Fan had sensed. It sensed that its perception had completely stuck to that power. No matter how it extracted, that perception was still tightly stuck to that power. However, very soon, its eyes were filled with excitement. This was because it suddenly realized that although its perception was still stuck there, in the process of withdrawing its perception, it was still able to absorb a large amount of perception back into its body at every moment. This process of absorption actually caused his perception to improve at every moment. In the blink of an eye, it had already surpassed the state of his perception at its peak. I can't believe there's such an opportunity." He was inexplicably excited, but in his heart, all kinds of subtle and profound cultivation methods had already appeared. It was a disadvantage that perception was stuck to that power. However, from another perspective, perhaps this could also be regarded as a kind of necessary condition for cultivation. It was just like how, if a living being wanted to cultivate, it needed to comprehend the world and place its mind on the world. However, at this time, its perception was stuck to that power. And the benefit of this condition was that one's perception could be easily and even endlessly enhanced. As expected, there are opportunities everywhere after ascension. At this moment, the monster almost forgot about the threat that Luo Fan posed to the world. Of course, perhaps it had already clearly felt Luo Fan's strength and understood that if it did its best to improve itself and make itself sublimate as much as possible, it would not be able to pose any threat to Luo Fan. Therefore, at this time, not only did it not try its best to stop its impulse like Luo Fan, but it also tried its best to urge its own perception back into its body as quickly as possible. For this, it had even specially created a brand new cultivation method that specifically targeted perception, so that its own perception could be retrieved faster, and it could more quickly integrate into its original perception. It was obvious that it had completely regarded this change as its own opportunity. His perception continued to increase during this process, doubling, tripling from its original peak state unknowingly. His perception had already increased to more than 1,000 times its original peak state. At this time, the monster gradually began to have an aura that did not exist before. It was an indifferent, ruthless, and extremely rational aura. Originally, it had been wary of Luo Fan, suspicious of him, and even worried about the world it came from, and other emotions had unknowingly disappeared without a trace. It has been assimilated. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan could not help but sigh inwardly. Perception was a part of a cultivator, just like a certain organ or a certain limb of a cultivator. As an organ or limb, the body part became stronger, which would naturally bring great or small benefits to a cultivator. There was naturally no doubt about this. However, it was obvious that this was not without limit. For example, if a certain limb of an ordinary person was enlarged to the point that it was hundreds or thousands of times larger than the rest of the body, would that person still be able to survive? The same principle applied to perception. As a part of a cultivator, it was the same. For a cultivator, the enhancement of perception was indeed beneficial, and it was not a small one. However, if the enhancement broke the balance of a cultivator's body or power, then this enhancement would become a burden to the cultivator, and it could even take the cultivator's life. At this time, the situation of the monster was clearly a sign that the balance had been broken. On the whole, perception was a part of a cultivator, and it needed to maintain a balance with many other existences in order for a cultivator to improve and grow in an orderly manner. From a detailed point of view, this perception was the bridge between the inside and outside of a cultivator. When this bridge was strengthened within a certain limit, it was a good thing for a cultivator because it could make the communication between the inside and outside of a cultivator smoother and more convenient. However, if this bridge exceeded a certain limit, it would cause the inside of a cultivator to be swallowed by the outside. Of course, this also depended on the strength of the cultivator. In other words, it depended on the size of the cultivator's interior. It was like two islands in the sea. The large island represented the outside of the cultivator, and the small island represented the inside of the cultivator. And perception was equivalent to the bridge between the two islands. If the small island was too small, when the bridge was about the same size as the small island, the two islands would naturally become one, and the small island would disappear. If the small island was large enough, the bridge would have to be larger to match the size of the small island. In this way, the small island would naturally be more tolerant of the bridge's size, and it would be able to accommodate a larger bridge. Therefore, if one wanted to improve perception, one had to improve oneself first and become more powerful. At this moment, the monster clearly didn't need to consider all of this. He only knew that the increase in his perception was beneficial to him, so he used the special characteristics of that power to endlessly increase his perception. In the end, his perception surpassed the limits that he could endure, causing everything outside of his body to completely devour the insides of his body through his perception, causing him to become a part of the outside. His self had unknowingly been split into countless fragments and dispersed throughout the outside world. In this place, the largest external force was clearly the insignificant portion below, but it was enough to give birth to a group of worlds. In other words, at this moment the monster could be said to have been assimilated by the power below, and it could be said to have become a part of that power. At this step, the monster naturally had no scruples, and it increased its perception even more rapidly, causing its perception to continuously multiply, 10,000 times, 100,000 times, 1,000,000 times. As this change occurred, the monster's body gradually melted, and the part of its body that came into contact with the power below began to rise and spread. Unknowingly, the monster's body had been completely swallowed by the power. When it was completely swallowed, the surroundings returned to how it was before the monster appeared. It was as if such a monster had never appeared before. So that's how it is. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan vaguely understood why he did not see any similar ascenders on the surface of this power before. Ascenders obviously did not leave their own world, and their own spacetime for fun. They must have made such a choice to pursue further. Under such circumstances, how could they not use their perception or anything else when they ascended to the surface of this power? Once they used their perception, no matter how cautious they were, their perception would inevitably come into contact with that power one day. Once they came into contact with that power, it would clearly mean that they had fallen into great danger. If they were even a little impulsive, they would end up like the monster. Therefore, that monster might not be the only ascender that had appeared since the existence of this power. Perhaps countless ascenders had already appeared before this. However, they were all devoured by that power due to various reasons. Is there anything else apart from perception? At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly had an inexplicable doubt in his heart. He had already confirmed that perception would cause that power to devour cultivators in the end. But what else apart from perception? If one were to say that only perception could cause such a result, he would not believe it at all. After all, Luo Fan only discovered that perception could cause such an outcome when he used his perception to probe this power. It was clearly impossible for things to be so coincidental. The first choice that Luo Fan made was the only choice that could cause serious consequences. Normally speaking, there were multiple types of dangers, perhaps dozens or hundreds of them, which was why Luo Fan had chosen it so coincidentally. Moreover, based on the current empty appearance of this power, this possibility was not small. After all, it would be a little far-fetched to say that every ascender had coincidentally used perception to cause their bodies to be devoured by the power. However, if there were a large number of dangers, it would be easier to explain. Chapter 2809. Luo Fan wasn't too worried that he would be devoured by that power like the monster. After all, his own strength wasn't something that the monster could compare to at all. For his perception to increase to the point where the power could devour him, even if he used that power to strengthen his perception, it would probably take thousands of years. Obviously, with his self-control, how could he not react after thousands of years and allow himself to be devoured by that power? However, although he wasn't worried that he would be devoured by that power, it didn't mean that he didn't care about his current state. At this moment, his perception was stuck to this power. Although this influence didn't affect him much, it was still a shackle. The existence of this shackle made it difficult for him to break free from this power and obtain true freedom. In this way, he naturally couldn't maintain this state forever, and he would have to get rid of this shackle sooner or later. With that thought, his figure had already stepped into the group of worlds, completely disappearing from the surface of that power. How amazing! Looking at this group of worlds, even though he had already sensed it through his perception, he couldn't help but feel an inexplicable admiration at this moment. There were hundreds of worlds in this group of worlds. These worlds were distributed in the void in a way that seemed to be random but also seemed to be following some special rules. There was an indescribable connection between these worlds, as if there were all kinds of invisible existences shuttling back and forth between the many worlds at every moment, communicating with each other. Each of these worlds was quite complete, so complete that Luo Fan even suspected that they would continue to exist without being affected even if they were directly thrown into a simulated chaotic state. The laws of the heavens and earth were rather complicated. Furthermore, the laws of the heavens and earth were vastly different from the laws of the other heavens and earth. It was as if different worlds followed different worldviews. Luo Fan's first target was naturally the world where the monster had ascended. Although the monster was born in this group of worlds. However, this didn't mean that the monster's hometown was the entire group of worlds. After all, the majority of living beings still needed to survive in the world. That monster was obviously one of the majority of living beings. Under such circumstances, the place of his birth was naturally one of the worlds within this group of worlds. That world was also the world with the strongest karmic connection with the monster. It was also the most obvious world when Luo Fan sensed this group of worlds. With a slight thought, Luo Fan's figure flew towards one of the hundreds of worlds in the center. Not long after, he had already arrived outside the world and was facing the barrier of the world. Every world had its own heavenly barrier. It was just that some were stronger and some were weaker. It was like simulating the state of chaos. If one directly entered a world through simulating the state of chaos, then the world barrier of that world would definitely be so strong that it would make one despair. Even Luo Fan might not have much chance of breaking through. However, if one wanted to enter that world through a certain simulated chaos layer, the situation would obviously be completely different. Once one tried to enter that world through this method, then the world barrier would become extremely weak, almost like a decoration. The reason why the heavenly barrier of the same world would be so different was actually very simple. It was because when one tried to directly enter the world through simulating the state of chaos, it was a part of the simulated state of chaos. If one wanted to enter the world, for the world that needed to isolate the simulated state of chaos, it was obviously equivalent to breaking the foundation of its existence. The barrier would naturally be as strong as it could be. However, if one used the simulated chaos layer to enter the world, the situation would obviously be different. For the world, joining a certain simulated chaos layer meant that it had already accepted everything in the simulated chaos layer. Under such circumstances, entering the world through the simulated chaos layer was equivalent to returning to the world as a part of the world. Naturally, the barrier would be reduced as much as possible. At this moment, the world barrier in front of Luo Fan existed in an extremely strange way. This kind of barrier was not as strong as the world barrier in the simulated state of chaos, but it was also not as weak as the world barrier in the simulated chaos layer. At first glance, this barrier seemed soft, as if it could be broken with just a little bit of force. However, if one carefully sensed it, they would discover that the barrier itself was rather tough. It seemed that no matter how much force was used, it could not be broken. This strange nature was vaguely similar to the force that Luo Fan had seen before, which was the supporting force of this world group. Of course, it was only a little. At least, when Luo Fan's perception swept over, this barrier did not have the force that could stick to his perception. In fact, it did not even have the force that could completely stop his perception from moving further in. At this moment, Luo Fan's perception had already directly probed into the world and instantly swept through everything in this world. As his perception swept across this part of the world, Luo Fan instantly determined the greatest characteristic of this part of the world. This world wasn't created by any existence. At the very least, it was not created by any creator of the world. The reason why he was so certain was because at this moment, when Luo Fan swept through this world, he saw that the intelligent creatures looked completely strange and did not have a fixed form at all. No wonder I felt that he was a monster. So that's why. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly understood why he had felt that the previous ascenders were monsters. The intelligent creatures looked strange and did not have a fixed form, which meant that this world did not have a born Taoism aptitude. Without a born Taoism aptitude, the creatures in this world could cultivate into whatever form they wanted. No matter what form they took, they would be treated equally by the world. They would not receive preferential treatment, nor would they be rejected by the world. Without the preferential treatment of the world, they would naturally not be adjusted by the world during the process of evolution. In this way, naturally, they would not be able to perfect and harmonize their bodies. At the very least, they would not be able to reach the level of perfection and harmony of the born Taoism aptitude. In the eyes of Luo Fan, who was used to seeing born Taoism aptitude, such creatures were naturally not perfect and harmonious enough. They appeared extremely ugly. The Ascenders were obviously such existences. If a world had a creator of the world, then the form of the creator of the world would naturally become the appearance of the born Taoism aptitude of the world. Just like the world that Luo Fan had created, the appearance of the born Taoism aptitude was Luo Fan's human form. If there was a creator of the world that looked like an octopus, then the born Taoism aptitude in that world would look like an octopus. This point was applicable to all corners of the world. Whether it was in the true state of chaos, the simulated state of chaos, or the nothingness, there was no doubt. But now there was no appearance of the born Taoism aptitude in this world, so there was obviously only one possibility. That was, there was no creator of the world in this world. In other words, this world was actually a world that was born of nature. With all sorts of thoughts running through his mind, Luo Fan moved forward, and in the blink of an eye, he had already stepped into that world. The barrier of the world produced an indescribable blocking force during this process, trying to keep him out of the world. However, this blocking force was completely insufficient for the light of the world. The light of the world did not even need to give rise to any complicated changes. It only needed to simulate the Ascenders to easily bypass the obstruction of the barrier of the world, allowing him to step into the world without being affected in any way. As soon as he entered the world, he instantly felt an extremely rich and wonderful information reverberating between the world. This aura was extremely mysterious and wonderful. It seemed to come from the world itself, but it also seemed to come from beyond the world. It also seemed to come from some kind of supreme and unimaginable existence. In an instant, Luo Fan knew that this world probably also had a legend of the heavens. This world also had its own civilization, as well as the world of cultivation. However, compared to other worlds with born Taoism aptitude, the civilization and the world of cultivation in this world appeared to be even more chaotic. Its level was also very uneven. Some places were quite prosperous, and the people had even transformed, and their essence had already been sublimated. However, some places were still in a state of almost primitive society, where all living beings in the entire civilization ate raw meat and drank blood. It was the same for the world of cultivation. Some places were already able to continuously nurture powerful cultivators who could destroy the world. There were also some places where one would have to pay a huge price to obtain even the slightest bit of extraordinary power. Moreover, apart from the chaos, there was also a huge problem with the communication between the various civilizations and the world of cultivation. From time to time, wars would break out between the various civilizations and the world of cultivation. It was precisely because of this that the entire world appeared to be extremely chaotic. After appearing in this world, Luo Fan quickly headed toward a certain place in this world. There was currently some kind of sacrificial ceremony going on in that place. This kind of sacrificial ceremony was somewhat similar to the one he saw in the doomed world. Both of them relied on the same sacrificial mountain, and a large number of living beings were kneeling and worshipping it. Even the runes on the mountain were somewhat similar. In the blink of an eye, Luo Fan had already traversed most of the world and appeared at the place where the sacrificial ceremony was being held. At this moment, there were at least tens of thousands of monster-like living beings around the sacrificial mountain, constantly kowtowing toward the mountain in the center. Many corpses were lying on the altar at the top of the mountain. Although the corpses were already dead, there was still a tremendous aura constantly emanating from them, stirring up the surrounding void. There were even faint cries of ghosts and gods coming from the corpses. At this moment, in a certain direction of the heaven-offering mountain peak, a towering platform was erected. On that platform, a massive being was praising loudly. The words of praise were extremely high-spirited and sacred. Every word and sentence expressed the living being's worship and reverence for the heavens. The sacrificial runes on the entire sacrificial mountain began to light up. An indescribable power began to circulate endlessly among the runes, gradually spreading throughout the entire mountain. The entire mountain began to shake violently as if the mountain was about to come to life. At this moment, an auspicious light gradually appeared in the sky. The moment the auspicious light appeared, the living beings who were kneeling in the surroundings became extremely excited. The living being on the platform was even more excited, as if it had received some sort of encouragement. The multicolored light became denser and stronger. In the end, it became like a second sun in the sky, giving off an incomparably dazzling feeling. A vortex gradually appeared in the multicolored light and began to spin rapidly. Gradually, it emitted an incredible suction force that acted on the center of the sacrificial mountain, on the large number of monster corpses. The corpses gradually began to float under the effect of this suction force, slowly drifting towards the vortex in the sky. In the end, the corpses entered the vortex and disappeared without a trace. After all the corpses disappeared completely, a stone tablet descended from the sky from the vortex and landed on the mountain, where the corpses were previously placed. When the surrounding living beings saw the appearance of the stone tablet, they seemed to have obtained infinite pleasure and began to crazily worship it. The living being on the platform couldn't help but feel grateful for the benevolence of the heavens, grateful for its generous gift. At this moment, Luo Fan swept a glance at the stone tablet and was slightly taken aback. Although it looked like a stone tablet on the surface, in reality, it wasn't a stone tablet at all. It was clearly a variety of unknown materials compressed and condensed together in some indescribable way, turning into the shape of a cuboid. In essence, it wasn't even a stone, let alone having no words on it. Chapter 28:10. To the stone tablet, what was truly valuable was obviously the information recorded on it. A stone tablet with no information recorded on it was obviously a half-finished stone tablet. The stone tablet that appeared before Luo Fan was clearly such a half-finished stone tablet. There was no information recorded on the stone tablet at all. The entire stone tablet was completely integrated, and there were no dents or protrusions at all. How valuable could such a half-finished stone tablet be? Luo Fan frowned. He locked his senses on the stone tablet and began to sense it more thoroughly. He believed that not all living beings in this world were stupid. They had chosen to offer sacrifices to the heavens and used countless living beings' corpses to exchange for such a stone tablet, which meant that the stone tablet had some special value. It was impossible for it to be a half-finished stone tablet without any information recorded on it. The stone tablet itself was made of an extremely special material, and its blocking effect on his senses was not considered weak. However, it was not that strong. He only exerted a little force, and his senses broke through the stone tablet's obstruction and directly penetrated its interior. At that moment, his expression changed drastically. A look of realization appeared in his eyes. The moment his senses broke through the stone tablet's obstruction and entered its depths, he had already figured out the so-called stone tablet's material. In reality, the stone tablet was not cut from any stone. In reality, it was formed by countless bones piled up and assembled in an unimaginable way. Among the many details on the stone tablet, one could find the characteristics of various living beings. The characteristics of these living beings were compressed and condensed in a special way, forming an almost inseparable whole that formed the final form of the stone tablet. On the surface, the stone tablet did not seem to contain any information. However, in reality, the secrets that countless living beings had been hiding within the stone tablet were revealed without any reservations. It could be said that as long as one could sense the information within the stone tablet, it would be equivalent to sensing the hidden potential of thousands of living beings, the hidden principles of their structures, and the hidden mysteries of cultivation that the world had added to it. Compared to direct cultivation manuals, not only was it not inferior, but it was even superior in certain aspects. At the very least, if it was a cultivation manual, it would only be useful for a certain type of living being. For living beings with different body structures and thought structures, the manual would not be as useful. Now, the stone tablet directly displayed the potential of living beings, the principles of living beings' structures, and the mysteries of cultivation contained within living beings. Clearly, any living being could easily construct a cultivation method that suited them through this information, and there was no such thing as adapting or not adapting at all. In this situation, it was obviously better than direct cultivation manuals. Moreover, apart from being adaptable, the information had another advantage. No matter what level the person comprehending it was, they would be able to gain something from it. Even ordinary living beings who did not grasp extraordinary abilities could comprehend some methods to grasp extraordinary abilities from the information. At Luo Fan's level, he would be able to gain a deeper understanding of the living beings in this world through the information contained within. His understanding of the survival logic and cultivation logic of the living beings in this world would also increase. This isn't a product of living beings' intelligence. After a long while, Luo Fan sighed, confirming this. From the stone tablet behind the vortex, or more accurately, where the so-called heavens were, there was no living beings while controlling the acceptance and feedback of the sacrificial offering. No matter how well hidden a product of living beings' intelligence was, it would definitely have a corresponding characteristic. Luo Fan was well aware of this. On the other hand, if it was naturally formed, in other words, something that was not constructed by living beings' intelligence, it would definitely have a similar corresponding characteristic, no matter how it was simulated. At this moment, what Luo Fan saw on the stone tablet was a characteristic that was not constructed by living beings' intelligence. In other words, it was a naturally formed characteristic. This characteristic that was not constructed by living beings' intelligence sounded mysterious, but it was actually not difficult to understand if one really understood it. It was like a person trying to carve a ball into the shape of a naturally existing stone. No matter how shocking the person's carving skills were, no matter how brilliant the person's intelligence was, as long as it was carved by the person, there would definitely be traces of carving. These traces were the characteristics of living beings' intelligence. Of course, using carving as an analogy was only the most basic, simplest, and easiest to distinguish situation. The characteristic that Luo Fan grasped was, of course, more obscure, more intrinsic, and more difficult to see than the traces of carving. By the same logic, it was naturally impossible to turn an irregular and naturally existing stone into a complete, round, flawless, and man-made ball. No matter how nature changed, whether it was exposed to the wind or scorched by the sun, whether it was struck by water or struck by lightning, even after millions of years, No matter how round the stone had become, there would still be traces of nature. In other words, some imperfect arcs could still be found. These natural traces were the characteristics that were not constructed by intelligent beings. Of course, similarly, using the transformation of an irregular stone into a ball as an analogy was naturally the most basic and ordinary one. The nature that Luo Fan grasped was also more obscure than this, and also more essential than this. And now, in the stone tablet that appeared in front of Luo Fan, he could see the nature of the structure that belonged to non-intelligent creatures. Among them, the most obvious one was that although the stone tablet seemed to be a perfect rectangular shape, if one looked closely, one would be able to discover some extremely indistinguishable irregularities on each surface. These irregularities caused the stone tablet to no longer be a perfect rectangular shape, but it made the stone tablet faintly more harmonious. Even Luo Fan gasped in amazement at this degree of harmony. If he had not seen this stone tablet, he would not have been able to create it. This alone was enough to confirm that the stone tablet was actually a product that was not constructed by intelligent beings. In other words, it was a natural product. What's more, in addition to this most obvious detail, there were many other more subtle and obscure details. All of these things were obvious to Luo Fan. Therefore, he could be completely sure that the stone tablet was actually a natural product. At the very least, in his understanding, it was a natural product. After understanding this, Luo Fan did not hesitate anymore. In a flash, he had already charged into the slowly disappearing vortex above him. Although he felt that a long time had passed just now, in reality, because of his self-adjustment, this period of time was only a few breaths' time compared to the outside world. In reality, because of his self-adjustment, this period of time was only a few breaths' time compared to the outside world. These few breaths' time was not enough for the vortex produced by the sacrificial ceremony to disappear completely. Therefore, at this moment, he could still use the vortex to head to the place behind the vortex where the so-called heaven was. This can't be like the predestined world that leads to the surface of that power. Where exactly does it lead to? Another power or the depths of that power? Such doubts lingered in Luo Fan's mind. If the sacrificial ceremony led to the surface of that power, then there would be no so-called ascension in this world. Everyone could use the sacrificial ceremony to head to the place after ascension. What ascension was there to speak of then? It clearly did not make sense for it to lead to another power. After all, this was only the surface of that power, and that power itself had the characteristics of being the heaven of other worlds. Since this power had such characteristics, the possibility of this world giving up what was close at hand to seek what was far away was not high. In this case, after thinking about it, the only possibility was that it led to the depths of that power. However, this was only a guess before the answer was revealed. As for the specifics, it would depend on the following result. At this moment, Luo Fan's figure kept moving forward along the vortex. All sorts of indescribable distortions vaguely appeared around his body. The distortions made it impossible for him to see his surroundings clearly. He could not even sense what exactly was around him. He did not know if it was space-time, some kind of matter, or pure nothingness. He could only feel that as he moved forward along the vortex, an increasingly powerful pressure was constantly pressing down on his body. Or rather, it was the heaven and earth light that was pressing down on the surface of his body. This pressure caused the heaven and earth light to continuously produce various changes in feedback, doing its best to neutralize the pressure and protect Luo Fan's body within the heaven and earth light. In the face of such changes, the heaven and earth light emitted an increasingly intense light that spread in all directions with all its might. This was clearly a sign that a portion of the heaven and earth light had leaked out due to the changes happening too quickly during the process. This made it even more difficult for Luo Fan to see his surroundings clearly and distinguish the situation around him. This was because the light that spread out also stirred up drastic changes in the surroundings, causing even more indescribable changes to swarm over and rapidly destroy the light. In this place, the characteristics of time that belonged to that world began to gradually disappear. A charm that transcended the influence of time and the changes in space-time gradually spread out from the surroundings. In the face of this situation, an indescribable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face, and his eyes gradually turned solemn. There was still a portion of his perception stuck to the surface of that power. But now, as he continued to move forward, he felt that his perception was constantly being stretched out. In this situation, it was as if he had become a kite, and the point where his perception was stuck to the power was like a reel of string that was being held. Now that he kept moving forward, the reel of string was constantly loosening, causing the line that was holding onto him to continuously stretch out. This change did not feel good. However, this change also allowed him to clearly sense which direction he was currently heading in. At this moment, the direction he was heading in was impressively the depths of that power. Those worlds were attached to the surface of that power. Although it seemed to be a large area with a vast space of hundreds of trillions of miles, in reality, when he entered this group of worlds, his perception did not stretch out at all. It was as if his location had not changed at all compared to the point where his perception was stuck to. Even if he casually entered a world in this group of worlds and crossed more than half of the distance in that world, the situation did not change at all. In comparison, he had only just entered the vortex, but he could already sense that his perception was being stretched to the extreme, and was continuously being stretched towards the depths of that power. From a macroscopic perspective, when he entered the group of worlds, his perception did not change at all. It did not even move the slightest bit. But when he entered the vortex, the perception line suddenly seemed to be pulled by a sharp arrow and shot towards the depths of that power, charging straight towards the core of that power. After advancing for a while, the perception line suddenly began to distort. It no longer moved in a straight line, but began to revolve around that power along a plane that was parallel to the surface of that power. In the end, after countless years and going around an unknown number of trillions of miles, it once again turned and moved in a straight line. After another distance, it once again moved horizontally and began to revolve around that power along a plane that was parallel to the surface of that power. Of course, compared to before, there were some changes in the direction of this revolution. Just like that, the lines of perception began to undergo incomparably strange and complicated intertwining changes within the power. And all of these changes were sensed by Luo Fan. After all, these elongated lines were his perception. Since it was his perception, he would naturally be able to clearly grasp any changes that occurred. In his perception, time continued to pass. 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years. Unknowingly, 300 million years had passed. Chapter 28:11. Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth was naturally much weaker than the perfect heaven and earth. However, this difference was only in terms of overall, macroscopic, and intrinsic quality. It did not mean that the light of heaven and earth was inferior to the perfect heaven and earth in all aspects. At the very least, in terms of combat, the light of heaven and earth would not be inferior to the perfect heaven and earth. After all, although the perfect heaven and earth was more perfect and had a higher intrinsic quality, it was still a world after all. The fundamental purpose of its existence was not for combat, but for more subtle, and more mysterious reasons. In this way, in terms of combat, it was naturally far less specialized than the light of heaven and earth that could be adjusted at will and could concentrate power and power together. Under such circumstances, even if the light of heaven and earth was inferior to the perfect heaven and earth in terms of intrinsic quality, if it was really used for defense, its effect would not be much different in a short period of time. Just like at this moment, as Luo Fan moved forward in the passage, His light of heaven and earth changed according to the changes in the environment of the outside world. According to the incredible pressure carried by the outside world, it produced all kinds of corresponding defensive power. The defensive effect was not much worse than the defensive effect of the perfect heaven and earth. On the other hand, although the heaven and earth was very close to the perfect heaven and earth, it was still not the perfect heaven and earth. Its defensive effect was still much weaker than the perfect heaven and earth. Therefore, the light of heaven and earth could resist and protect the terrifying pressure from Luo Fan, but for the heaven and earth, it was already enough to be fatal. Fortunately, Luo Fan had already tempered his mind to the extreme. He could already treat hundreds of millions of years as an instant, and his mind would not change because of the passage of time. Otherwise, just moving forward for 300 million years without a destination would probably be enough to leave a deep scar in his heart. I'm almost there. Feeling the traces of his perception being pulled out by the power, Luo Fan gradually made a judgment in his heart. At first glance, the trajectory formed by the stretching and distortion of his perception seemed very ordinary, as if it was just a chaotic trajectory formed at random. However, Luo Fan, who had grasped the entire process in his heart and clearly sensed every bend and twist of this perception, understood that it might be a random trajectory, but it was definitely not a chaotic trajectory. This trajectory was actually forming a natural rune. It was a three-dimensional rune that contained endless principles and mysteries. This rune existed in that power and filled every inch of it. It possessed a power that he could not understand at all. In the process of being outlined, Luo Fan felt that his perception seemed to be undergoing some extremely subtle changes. It seemed that he had become more intimate with this power. The secrets of this power that he could not understand before seemed to be gradually becoming easier to understand at this moment. Of course, this rune was only a part of a complete rune. It was equivalent to a broken rune. Therefore, at this moment, Luo Fan's perception of this rune was still like looking at flowers in a fog, vague and illusory. Therefore, although he seemed to be able to sense the mysteries within and could understand this power through this rune, all of this could not withstand further pondering. Once he truly delved into it, everything that he had previously obtained would seem specious but actually wrong. At this moment, the reason why he was sure that he was almost at the end was because the natural rune that his perception had been pulled out was almost complete. Although the completion of the natural runes did not mean that they had reached the end of the passageway, who knew if the natural runes were the entirety of the passageway? Perhaps the runes were only a small portion of the passageway. However, the possibility that it was the end was ultimately greater than the possibility that this was only an extremely small part of the passage. When making a judgment, Luo Fan was naturally inclined to believe that this was a higher possibility. Sure enough, several years passed in Luo Fan's perception. On this day, a strange cavity suddenly appeared in front of him. The cavity was so strange. One would naturally know that it was an empty cavity just by sensing its existence. It was a place of nothingness that did not even have time, space, matter, energy, rules, laws, or anything else. The instant Luo Fan sensed the existence of the cavity, he suddenly felt his surroundings become empty, and he was already inside the cavity. In the nothingness where time and space did not exist, the so-called surroundings and the so-called length of time were naturally meaningless. In fact, the so-called concept of time was already meaningless. After an unknown period of time, when Luo Fan reacted, he was already enveloped by an indescribable power. This power was so mysterious that the nothingness of time and space seemed to be suppressed by this power. At this moment, the space-time dimension that belonged to Luo Fan expanded in this power, becoming a space-time that belonged to him. In this space-time, the light of heaven and earth existed at the edge of the power, and there were countless indescribable changes that were constantly being generated, combining with the sudden power of the outside world. In the end, the indescribable nothingness of the outside world was resisted, allowing Luo Fan to regain the ability to think and regain his own space-time dimension. What a strange void! I was almost assimilated. At this moment, Luo Fan seemed to wake up from a dream, and an indescribable fear arose in his heart. It must be said that if he did not recover, he would exist in this void forever. Of course, the concept of eternity actually did not exist at that time. Perhaps he would only wake up when this force was completely destroyed, the void was completely destroyed, or even the entire simulated chaotic state was completely destroyed, and he would directly face the result of destruction as if he had not experienced it at all. Fortunately, his light of heaven and earth was mysterious enough, and the sudden power was ingenious. Otherwise, his seventh tribulation this time would probably be like this. If that was really the result, it would be too unjust. Of course, at this moment, he also understood where this indescribable power came from. This power came from his senses. It was not the senses in his body at this moment, but the senses that existed in the power that had been stretched. Or more accurately, it came from the natural rune that was outlined by his senses. The natural rune was extremely mysterious, but it was essentially a part of that power. Or rather, it was a manifestation of the essence of that power. Its birth was the result of the interaction between the void and the world that existed in that power. That's right, the world cluster actually existed in that power. However, compared to the existence and power within the scope of normal understanding, the world cluster actually existed on the surface of that power. Of course, even the surface was already a part of the power. Since it was a part of the power, it would naturally have a strong or weak connection with every part of the power. It was the same for the nothingness in this place. This void was also a part of this power, even though it appeared to be a void that didn't exist. However, from the inconceivable infection and assimilation abilities of nothingness, it could be seen that it wasn't an ordinary nothingness. It wasn't the normal kind of nothingness that could extract everything and leave nothing behind. Since it was not an ordinary void and was within that power, it was naturally a part of that power. Or rather, it was another manifestation of that power. Therefore, there must be a connection between the void and the world cluster. This connection was extremely subtle as the connection between two particles in the universe that were separated by trillions of light years. Normally, such a connection was not very likely to be caught. However, it could not be helped. In the world cluster, perhaps it was a coincidence, perhaps it was some kind of inevitable rule, or perhaps it was simply the result of a sudden change in the wisdom of living beings. In short, this connection that should have been overlooked was caught. This void was revered as heaven by the living beings in the world cluster. They constantly used that subtle connection, the method of sacrifices, and the magical effects of the various sacrifices to continuously use the characteristics of the void to modify and feed back the previous sacrifices. In the end, through these modified sacrifices, they obtained the various principles and mysteries that belonged to this power that should have been hidden in the world. After this subtle connection was strengthened, it manifested in the form of natural runes. In fact, strictly speaking, this natural rune did not exist before Luo Fan discovered it. It was because Luo Fan had passed through this passage, and because his perception was constantly tracing this passage, that this natural rune that originally didn't exist appeared. It could be said that the rune was not purely a creation of this power. Instead, it was a joint creation of Luo Fan's senses and this power. The result of this creation was that the natural rune was extremely close to Luo Fan, allowing him to use certain methods to obtain the power of the natural rune. In other words, at this very moment, the barely distorted nothingness that appeared around his body, and together with the light of the world, allowed Luo Fan's own space-time dimension to display the kind of power that could be displayed. So that's how it is. Sensing that the power that contained endless secrets was constantly undergoing subtle changes under his thoughts, an indescribable joy flashed across Luo Fan's heart. Through this power, His perception had already undergone some kind of subtle transformation. This transformation allowed his senses to clearly sense the mysteriousness of this energy. Although he still couldn't comprehend all the profundities of this energy, he had at least opened the door to comprehending this energy. Where did this power come from? It was not a difficult puzzle to solve. In Luo Fan's seventh Great Tribulation, it could almost ignore all the forces and changes in this seventh Great Tribulation. Apart from the existence related to the true divine, what other power could do this? Therefore, this power could only come from an existence related to a true saint. Perhaps it did not come directly from a true saint, but it must have come from an existence similar to an artifact of a true saint. Only such an existence could be completely incomprehensible to him. Why would a power related to a true saint enter my tribulation? This doubt flashed across Luo Fan's mind at this moment. However, very soon, he cast this doubt aside. It was very normal for a tribulation to be related to a true saint. For example, in the previous few tribulations, there was one that directly replicated the projection of a true saint, and another time, it directly used the power of a true saint as the core to build a test for him. It was like this before, so it did not seem surprising that a power related to a true saint would appear in the seventh tribulation this time. Even if this power did not seem to participate in his test and did not directly attack him, it was also not surprising. An existence at the level of a true saint was already far beyond the scope of what Luo Fan could understand. Such an existence, even if it was even a little related to it, would inevitably cause incredible changes because of its existence. Even if it was a power replicated or stolen by the tribulation, or even a projection of the power, it would certainly not completely follow the rules of the tribulation like ordinary power, nor would it completely follow the requirements of the tribulation. Therefore, this kind of power related to a true saint completely ignored the tribulation, but chose a very safe place in the tribulation to watch everything develop, which was actually extremely normal. Thinking of this, Luo Fan could not help but feel inexplicably envious. It was a kind of envy for an existence like a true saint. Although he could be considered to be relatively well in the current tribulation, he was still greatly restricted by the tribulation. In the end, it was difficult for him to escape from the tribulation, and he had to endure the test of the tribulation again and again. However, at the level of a true saint, even if a little power was replicated or even stolen using unknown methods, he could completely ignore the tribulation and obtain power that surpassed the power of the replicated one. In the face of such a huge gap, how could Luo Fan, who wholeheartedly pursued to become a true saint, wholeheartedly pursued to be eternally indestructible, not be envious? How could he not yearn for this? Chapter 28:12. Although there seemed to be nothing in this void, one could tell from the fact that it existed in the core range of this power that this void was extremely important. In fact, it might even contain the core mystery of this power. Perhaps it was because his perception had undergone an inexplicable and subtle change after being transformed by the natural rune, or perhaps it was because of the characteristics of this void. In short, compared to the main body of the external power, Luo Fan's perception of this void was not as fruitless as it was when he sensed the power. Instead, as he concentrated, wisps of information gradually flowed into his mind. This information was extremely mysterious and wonderful. It seemed to contain endless truths and mysteries. It also seemed to contain nothing, and the information that existed was just chaotic and disorderly information. This situation was rather familiar to Luo Fan. This was the situation that occurred when he sensed all kinds of things related to the true sage. After discovering this, Luo Fan was completely certain that the power in front of him was obviously related to the true sage. Endless information was continuously injected into his heart. As he tried his best to sort it out, bits and pieces of it began to be sorted out and turned into all kinds of mysteries related to his cultivation and his worldview of laws. Like a spring breeze and rain, they gradually integrated into his worldview of laws, causing his worldview of laws to gradually undergo subtle changes during this process. Luo Fan's worldview was currently extremely imperfect. This had started ever since he used the many parallel worlds of the world of laws to sort out the various concepts related to the parallel world. In fact, when he integrated the corresponding concepts into it back then, although he had already exhausted his abilities, he was actually quite aware that these concepts were imperfect and had huge deviations. He still needed to polish and modify them countless times before they could truly become the fulcrum of a perfect worldview. It was just that this was a necessary process for him to go through, and it was a necessary stage for him to get through the Great Tribulation. This made him integrate these concepts into his worldview, regardless of the imperfections. After realizing this, Luo Fan naturally couldn't completely ignore these concepts after that. In fact, after these concepts were truly integrated into his worldview, he had been paying attention to these concepts at all times, constantly digging into his heart, and constantly experiencing all kinds of things in the outside world to try his best to transform these concepts and make them truly perfect. At this time, he naturally used the information that he had obtained from the surrounding energy that was obviously related to the true divine. Of course, he was extremely cautious during this process. The knowledgeable Luo Fan was extremely clear about what kind of existence the power related to the true sage was. This kind of power could be said to contain traces of the essence of a true sage. If he was not careful, he would be infected by that essence, and in the end, his worldview would be distorted by that essence. Once that happened, it would be equivalent to his future being completely cut off. From then on, not only would it be impossible for him to become a true sage again, even his ego might become impure. It was precisely because of this that he was so cautious in sorting out the information at this time. He only dug out the traces that he could understand, but he did not completely let go of himself and accept the information in detail. Otherwise, if he really let go of himself and accepted the information without any scruples, the gains he would obtain at this time would probably be more than 10,000 times more than what he was getting now. Even if it was tens of thousands of times more information, it was still insignificant compared to the information that was revealed in the void. Of course, even though he was so cautious, it was impossible for him to completely avoid being affected and infected. It could only be said that he was trying to reduce this possibility as much as possible. If he thought that he could rest easy just like that, what awaited him in the end would probably be distorted without him knowing it. Therefore, even though he tried to slow down his absorption process as much as possible, he still checked himself at all times to ensure that his ego would not be affected and that his worldview would not deviate. Fortunately, the concepts that he had transformed with the information he had absorbed were only a part of the core of the world of laws. Even if there were deviations, the core of the world of laws would still be able to discover them very quickly, so he wouldn't have to wait for them to accumulate and become helpless. This method of absorbing the surrounding information was not considered efficient. In fact, it could be said that the efficiency had been reduced to an unbelievable level. If he really wanted to absorb the information contained in the void in the outside world, the best way to do it given Luo Fan's current situation was actually obvious. As long as he used the heaven and earth light that was covering the surface of his body to convert the countless information, he would naturally be able to absorb the information in a more efficient way. After all, the information that came from the void was related to true sages, and the level of this information was already beyond the understanding of cultivators who had not become true sages. In contrast, it was more in line with the will of heaven and earth. In other words, if the will of heaven and earth were to accept this information, it would definitely be easier to understand, and it might even be able to understand it completely. Obviously, Luo Fan's heaven and earth light contained a will similar to the will of heaven and earth. Therefore, the heaven and earth light was obviously easier to understand, and it might even be able to completely understand this kind of profound and mysterious information that was transmitted from the void. On the other hand, Luo Fan was the owner of the heaven and earth light. Although he could not completely accept all the information in the heaven and earth light that he could understand, he could control the heaven and earth light and make it display the information in a way that he could understand. In other words, translation in layman's terms. This kind of translation naturally could not completely translate the true essence of the information, but it would still be able to obtain some mysteries. Compared to Luo Fan's current efficiency, these 2 or 3 profundities were already tens of thousands of times stronger. However, even though there was such a convenient method, Luo Fan did not intend to use it at all. The reason for this was actually very simple. Because once he did this, he might be completely assimilated by the information within without any resistance. His worldview might be completely distorted by the information. The more Luo Fan improved, the more he could see how much stronger a true sage was compared to a true sage being at Luo Fan's level. In the past, when he was still at the innate Grand Luo realm, he thought that he would be comparable to a true sage once he reached the end of the innate Grand Luo realm. After that, when he advanced to the Sage-to-be realm, he thought that as long as he advanced to the end of the Sage-to-be realm, he would be able to become a true sage. After that, when he advanced to the false sage realm, he realized that the false sage realm was actually extremely far from the true sage realm, and he still needed to advance to the peak of the false sage realm. In this way, time after time, his understanding of the true sage realm was refreshed. In other words, time after time, he discovered that the gap between him and a true sage was getting bigger and bigger. Could it be that the more he advanced, the smaller the possibility of him becoming a true sage was? Of course, that was impossible. In this world, there was no such thing as the further one advanced, the further one was from a higher goal. Obviously, this was because the more he advanced, the more he recognized the truth. The more he advanced, the more he knew how big the goal was. At this time, Luo Fan had already improved by hundreds of millions of times, and he was even in his 7th major tribulation. It seemed that he was only left with the 8th major tribulation and the 9th major tribulation to become a true sage. However, did this mean that the gap between him and a true sage was negligible? In fact, it was not just negligible. He even felt that the gap between him and a true sage was even greater than the gap he felt when he was in the innate zenith heaven realm. This situation was like a circle and a vast universe. The bigger the circle, the more he felt that he did not know, and the more he felt that the universe was vast. Under such circumstances, in his heart, it was self-evident how mysterious the information related to a true sage was. If the information was completely revealed in front of him, Luo Fan did not have the slightest confidence that he would be able to protect his own heart. He did not have the slightest confidence that the information contained within would not break through his understanding of heaven and earth, break through his understanding of the world, and break through his understanding of the chaos. As for his understanding of heaven and earth, his understanding of the many worlds, and his understanding of the chaos, it was obviously his unique worldview. Therefore, he obviously did not have the slightest confidence that he would be able to protect his worldview in the face of such unbelievable information. He did not have the slightest confidence that he would be able to protect himself in the face of such information. This was not because he was not confident enough, nor was it because his heart was not firm enough. Instead, it was because the true distance was there. An ant would not be able to survive the destruction of the universe because of a firm heart. Compared to that information, Luo Fan's heart was obviously just like that of an ant. In the face of the impact of that information, his heart was like that of an ant facing the destruction of the universe. This outcome was not something that could be reversed by whether his heart was firm or not, nor was it something that could be reversed by his lack of confidence. Luo Fan was very clear about this. Therefore, at this moment, he directly abandoned the method of directly absorbing the information with the highest efficiency. Instead, he used his own ability to absorb the information bit by bit. With great difficulty, he extracted the information bit by bit and integrated the parts that he could understand and grasp into his own worldview. Although this method still had some hidden dangers, it was clearly within his acceptable range. This was like an ant facing a universe. If it directly opened its body to accept the universe, it would only be crushed and assimilated by the universe, completely losing the concept of an individual. If it was careful and only relied on its own body to gnaw at the universe bit by bit, then perhaps it would not be able to completely gnaw at the entire universe, but it would have the opportunity to gnaw at nutrients that could make it expand hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of times. At this moment, Luo Fan was like that ant. The information contained in the surrounding nothingness was endless. At least, the information that he could perceive was endless. Every moment, Luo Fan felt that his body was constantly expanding, and his worldview was changing at the same time. These changes sometimes made his worldview more perfect and rapidly move in the right direction. But sometimes it was the opposite, distorting his worldview and making it lose its essence. Fortunately, Luo Fan was constantly paying attention and immediately discovered the slightest abnormality, which prevented his worldview from really going astray. Once there were signs of development in other directions, he would immediately call a halt and start sorting out the affected changes again. The information was all-encompassing, and he could find almost anything he wanted. Whether it was related to the world, cultivation, living beings, or even all kinds of crude and dirty things, he could find everything in it. Through this information, Luo Fan seemed to be soaring in countless worlds at every moment, experiencing all kinds of wonderful worlds that he had never seen or even heard of before. This would naturally bring endless benefits to the perfection of his world view of laws. One had to know that the reason why he felt that there were many omissions and inadequacies in his previous worldview was because those concepts were perfected based on his previous memories and his own world of laws. The defects and hidden dangers caused by the lack of reference numbers could naturally be made up for by increasing the number of references. At this time, the endless information that emerged from the nothingness was obviously an endless reference. For him, it was obviously the best existence to make up for the defects and hidden dangers in his worldview. Faced with such a situation, one could imagine the improvement of Luo Fan's worldview. Of course, although the improvement was huge, the time it took was also extremely long. Chapter 28:13. Perhaps hundreds of millions of years had passed in his perception, but to other worlds, it was only a few breaths. At a certain moment, Luo Fan, who was in the void, trembled slightly. Immediately after, his perception, which had been pulled into the natural rune, trembled slightly and began to undergo all kinds of indescribable subtle changes. Amidst the changes, the entire force was shaken. This force was a supreme force related to true saint. When it appeared in the depths of the tribulation level, it naturally radiated across the entire tribulation level. Any changes that happened to it would naturally affect all aspects of the tribulation level, including but not limited to the tribulation world. The tribulation layer affected everything in the simulated chaos, including all the creators and all the living beings in the simulated chaos. Translator, Zephy Z. Editor. Dio Quinn. At this moment, the change in this force instantly affected everything. In the blink of an eye, the simulated chaos state underwent an indescribable change. The world that was originally in the midst of the tribulations suddenly discovered that the tribulations had changed and became intermittent. Meanwhile, the world that was originally not in the midst of the tribulations suddenly discovered that all sorts of signs of tribulations had appeared in its own world. This change would naturally not let go of the transportation network layer, the many worlds in the transportation network layer, and Luo Fan's world of laws. At this moment, signs of tribulation began to appear everywhere in the transportation network layer. Many of the world founders had originally regarded Luo Fan, who might or might not exist, as their imaginary enemy, but they did not expect that the tribulation would suddenly descend without any warning. The transportation network layer, which had just passed the tribulation not long ago, actually showed signs of tribulation again. This change instantly shocked many of the world founders, and they no longer had any thoughts of planning to deal with the world of laws. The range of influence of the plain tribulation was huge. All the heavens and earths had experienced it. At this time, all of them were naturally aware of it. Perhaps the restrictions and shackles placed on them by the heavens and earths were very troublesome, but that kind of trouble happened in an invisible manner and existed in a slow manner. However, if the tribulation really broke out, it was possible that their entire world would be completely erased, and they, as the world founders, would also be completely destroyed. Under such circumstances, how could the founders of the universe not know what to focus on? Compared to these world founders, the heavenly Tao in the world of laws was much more relaxed. Although the world of laws was also affected by the changes, the impact wasn't too strong. At the very least, given the tolerance of the world of laws, there wouldn't be any signs of a true tribulation, and it wouldn't fall into another great tribulation. Since it would not fall into another great tribulation, it would naturally not become a unit of the tribulation. Since it would not become a unit of the tribulation would not have much impact on the world of laws. Of course, at this moment, in the face of such a change, the heavenly Tao got a chance of breathing compared to the other world founders. He no longer had to worry about the other world founders finding trouble with him of the world founders. The creators of the world no longer came looking for trouble, which meant that the heavenly axiom had more time and energy to perfect its view of the world. Even though Luo Fan felt that he had been in the void within the power for hundreds of millions of years, he still felt that it was impossible for him to enter the void. However, in reality, it had only been several tens of thousands of years since the last time the world of laws had been tested by the many founders of the world. This amount of time was obviously insignificant to the entire process of perfecting the embryonic form of his worldview. Therefore, at this moment, the embryonic form of the heavenly axiom's worldview was not much more complete than before. It was still extremely broken and crude, in a state that urgently needed to be perfected and replenished. Now that he had a chance to catch his breath, how would the heavenly Tao choose? Was there a need to say anything else? He instantly manipulated the world and released a power that isolated the world from the outside world, isolating the world from the transportation network layer as much as possible. This kind of isolation actually did not have much effect in essence. After all, the world of laws was the core of the transportation network layer, and its existence was closely related to the transportation network layer. Even though the transportation network layer had truly been accepted by the simulated chaotic state after passing through a layer tribulation and was no longer completely controlled by the world of laws, it was still the same. Therefore, if he wanted to completely separate the world of laws from the transportation network layer, he couldn't just manipulate power to separate them. In addition to paying a higher price, he also needed more complicated means to achieve this. In fact, although such a separation didn't have much effect in essence, it represented the will of the world of laws and its transcendent attitude. The layer tribulation still didn't have much effect on the world of laws at this time. If the world of laws took the initiative to participate in the layer tribulation, it would be equivalent to an existence that could originally be transcendent throwing itself into the tribulation. If it took the initiative to find trouble, the layer tribulation would naturally not stand on ceremony and include the world of laws. However, if the layer tribulation didn't take the initiative to participate, then the layer tribulation wouldn't be able to do anything to the world of laws. The restrictions it faced prevented it from directly breaking in and affecting the world of laws. At this time, the world of laws controlled by the heavenly way reacted by taking the initiative to draw a boundary with the transportation network layer, actively cutting off the possibility of affecting the other worlds in the transportation network layer. In this way, it naturally avoided being affected by the layer tribulation as much as possible. This situation was witnessed by the other pioneers of the world, so they were naturally displeased. At this time, it was the entire transportation network layer that was suffering the tribulation. Now, as the core of the transportation network layer, the world of laws actually completely ignored the situation in the transportation network layer. It didn't care that the transportation network layer might collapse during the tribulation, and was completely acting as a passerby. How could the other world founders get used to this? However, even if they couldn't stand it, they didn't have the mood to care about the world of laws or the heavenly way at this time. At this time, those worlds wished they could treat every minute as billions of years to prepare for the layer tribulation. How could they have the time to care about the choice of the world of laws? The entire transportation network layer fell into an extremely strange atmosphere, as if a storm was brewing. At the same time, similar to the transportation network layer, the situation in many other layers that simulated the state of chaos was also similar. Of course, similar situations didn't mean that the behavior was exactly the same. Some of the simulated chaotic layers were originally in the midst of the layer tribulation, but under this sudden change, the layer tribulation suddenly disappeared. The entire simulated chaotic layer, along with many other worlds within it, received great benefits, which was almost the complete opposite of the situation in the transportation network layer. It was the same for many other worlds. Similarly, some obtained benefits, while others encountered greater disasters. In a certain area of the simulated chaotic state, there was an incomparably huge, vast, and prosperous world that existed in the simulated chaotic state like the center of chaos. In the eyes of the world's founders who could sense its existence, this world was like an incomparably huge sun, constantly releasing endless influence. At this time, countless spots suddenly appeared in this world that seemed to be the center of the simulated chaotic state. These spots were extremely mottled, appearing on the surface of the world like dirty water being splashed. They were densely packed, increasing in number and size. Gradually, they covered up the influence that was like sunlight being released by the world. Outside this world, there were countless stars twinkling brightly. The influence radiated by each of these stars was thousands of times stronger than the influence radiated by the world of laws. The world of laws still needed to use various means to resonate with other worlds in order to establish a connection with them and pull them into the transportation network layer. On the other hand, the stars were completely different. They only existed in a simulated state of chaos, and there would naturally be countless worlds drawing closer to them on their own, changing themselves into a state that could be accepted by the stars. In fact, in the simulated chaotic state, distance itself didn't have much meaning. At this time, these stars could appear around the largest, sun-like existence in the starry sky, which actually meant that these worlds had an incomparably close connection with the sun-like world in the center. Or perhaps it could be said that the world itself already had a lot in common with the sun. If it weren't for the fact that the world was too huge and vast, perhaps the sun and the other stars would have already combined into a simulated chaotic layer with the sun as the core. However, even if you didn't form a simulated chaotic layer, it didn't mean that the connection between the sun and other worlds was gone. In fact, although there was no simulated chaotic layer, just the influence radiated by the world itself was already equivalent to the essence of the simulated chaotic layer. These influences already possessed the various functions and properties of the simulated chaotic layer itself. Through these influences, any living being could walk and come and go as they pleased, as if they were in the simulated chaotic layer. On the other hand, the stars around the sun also had similar properties. It was just that they were slightly weaker than the sun. At this time, countless spots appeared on the sun, and the influence was unimaginable. In the blink of an eye, everything within the range of the sun's influence started to shake. The original stability had completely disappeared. All the worlds and all the matter became extremely turbulent at this moment. The worlds that were originally relying on the influence of the sun to communicate with other worlds suddenly discovered that they seemed to have been abandoned by the entire simulated chaotic state, and all contact with the outside world was severed. Even the communication with the outside world was instantly cut off. Just as they were still bewildered, all sorts of changes suddenly occurred in their world. Either a tribulation was about to befall them, or the tribulation suddenly disappeared, or they were suddenly connected to an unfamiliar simulated chaotic layer, or they were suddenly fought over by multiple simulated chaotic layers. All sorts of indescribable changes made the world's founders completely unable to understand what was going on. What's going on? My world has already gone through 7 major tribulations, and there should be no tribulations or immeasurable tribulations. Why is there suddenly a tribulation? In the world that resembled the sun, the founder of this world was a little bewildered. The appearance of this world's founder was very strange. Purely in terms of appearance, he was completely worthy of being called a monster by Luo Fan. However, because there was an indescribable sense of harmony and perfection on his body, it was impossible for him to really call him a monster. Evidently, although his appearance did not fit Luo Fan's aesthetic standards, this living being was still a natural Taoism body of a certain world. This living being's level was extremely high, and it was at least equivalent to a powerhouse who had gone through 7 major tribulations. Such a powerhouse was already not too far off from Luo Fan in terms of cultivation level. If the world that had gone through 7 major tribulations was added to the world that had reached a level of perfection that the simulated chaotic state could accept, its strength would definitely be above Luo Fan's. That's right, the simulated chaotic state was ultimately not the true chaotic state. There were no 9 major tribulations here. There were only 7 major tribulations here. In the true chaotic state, a perfect world that had gone through 9 major tribulations would transform into a large world without tribulations or immeasurable tribulations. However, in this simulated chaotic state, a large world could not be born. In the simulated chaotic state, there were no existences like 8 or 9 major tribulations. For this simulated chaotic state, 7 major tribulations was already the maximum number of tribulations that any world could encounter. In any world, no matter how amazing it was, no matter how lucky it was, at most, it could only survive 7 great tribulations of heaven and earth. Moreover, a world that had gone through 7 major tribulations was not like a world that had gone through 9 major tribulations in the true chaotic state, and would transform into a large world. Instead, it would only transform into a perfect world. Its level was countless times stronger than an ordinary world, but it could not reach the level of a large world. Chapter 28:14. Even if the simulated state of chaos was extremely close to the state of chaos in certain aspects, it still wasn't the true state of chaos. Compared to the true state of chaos, there were naturally many disparities. The number of tribulations and the strongest level of the world was one of the many disparities. This world that had passed the 7th tribulation had reached a state where it couldn't be improved anymore. From a certain perspective, it had already become the essence of this world. But at this moment, this world was facing a tribulation, and it was so ferocious and unstoppable. In just the blink of an eye, the entire world had fallen into that tribulation. At a glance, it was almost impossible to find the location of the transcending tribulation. Even the creator of this world would find it hard to react to such a sudden change, let alone the living beings in this world. The tribulation was already extremely destructive, but because the living beings were too clumsy in dealing with it, not only did they fail to eliminate the destruction caused by the tribulation, but they even increased it in other aspects. As a result, the destructive effect of the tribulation was several times or even more than 10 times stronger than it should have been. Ever since the world was completed, it had constantly radiated to other worlds, affecting those worlds that were similar in nature to it. Therefore, the changes that occurred in this world would naturally spread to other worlds through this radiation. In other words, the countless stars that seemed to have appeared around the sun in just the blink of an eye, most of the stars had fallen into the violent changes of the tribulation. The tribulations that had been triggered might suddenly disappear in the next instant, and the tribulations that had originally disappeared might suddenly be triggered once again. It felt as if there was a naughty child playing with the tribulations of the world in an extremely casual manner. Of course, this was only the case for most of the stars. In fact, apart from most of the stars or worlds that were affected, there was a small portion of stars or worlds that weren't affected. They existed within the range of the central sun's radiation. As the countless stars around them flickered and flickered, they quietly hung among the countless stars, as if they were stable points in the starry sky. Compared to the flickering stars, the bright stars did not seem to be affected by the destruction of the central sun. However, in reality, these stars that could be the exception were not really unaffected. They were really not under the control of the tribulations. In fact, it was the exact opposite. The behavior of these heavens and earth was actually a direct and absolute manifestation of the influence they had received. In other worlds, this kind of influence received from the radiation from the core world at the center would directly change through the nature of the world itself, and then cause changes in the tribulation level, causing the tribulation level to either send down or eliminate the tribulation according to the situation of the world. This might seem like a huge impact, but it was actually because the world was still operating normally. The relationship between the world and the tribulation level was still within the normal range. This kind of impact on the tribulation would still be shown through the tribulation level, and these seemingly unaffected worlds directly absorbed the destruction radiated by the perfect world in the center. All the destruction directly sank into the interior of the world and started to show signs of destruction on the essence of the world. The world seemed to be completely unaffected, but in fact, the insides of the world were already being corroded. The difference between the two was self-evident. At this moment, the worlds that were undergoing tribulations were still fine. Although they seemed to be changing violently and seemed extremely strange, they were still able to completely exist in the simulated state of chaos. In contrast, the few worlds that seemed completely unaffected and still emitted stable light gradually emitted an aura that was getting closer and closer to death. Even if there seemed to be no change on the surface, for some reason, it gave people the feeling that even if it completely extinguished in the next moment, it would not be strange. Perhaps this is my chance. Compared to the surrounding star-like worlds that mostly fell into a state of panic and fear, the attitude of the creator of the perfect world in the center was different. At the beginning, he was indeed at a loss for the world that had suddenly encountered a tribulation. But very soon, he understood that this was actually his chance. This was his chance to break through to the perfect world and advance a step further. Tribulation was a disaster, a test, and also an opportunity. The reason why this world could become a perfect world was because it had survived a total of 7 tribulations of the world, and every time it survived a tribulation, the world would be greatly improved. 7 tribulations of the world meant 7 opportunities. For this perfect world, the boundless tribulation had actually lasted for countless trillions of years. In the beginning, this boundless tribulation naturally made the creator of the world feel extremely satisfied. It made him feel relaxed and happy that he had never felt before. But as time passed, as the days of the boundless tribulation grew longer and longer, he more and more realized that this kind of life was actually not that interesting. It was indeed relaxing to be boundless tribulation, but at the same time, without the tribulations, there would be no opportunity, and there would be no improvement. Under such circumstances, the longer time passed, the more the Creator of the world yearned for the tribulations. Previously, the sudden and violent outbreak of the tribulations made him unable to react, which made him feel somewhat at a loss. But when he came back to his senses, he was rather satisfied with the appearance of this tribulation. The tribulations that this perfect world encountered were extremely terrifying. If it was in an ordinary world, even if it had survived the sixth boundless tribulation, it would probably be enough to make it fall instantly and never be able to reincarnate. However, for this perfect world that had been boundless tribulation for countless years and had accumulated an immeasurable amount of foundation, although this kind of terrifying disaster was not nothing, it was not fatal either. The entire world seemed to have been completely overturned by the destruction brought about by the tribulations, as if it had fallen into the end of the world, and everything could no longer be salvaged. However, as the Creator of the world began to activate the foundation of the world and began to activate the accumulation that had been accumulated for billions of trillions of years of peace, the entire world seemed to have been injected with boundless vitality. It began to give birth to countless targeted changes at every moment. It was as if creatures that had originally been wiped out had suddenly reappeared due to various coincidences. They had even absorbed the experience of being wiped out, becoming stronger and more complete. It was also as if a certain source of destruction had suddenly been born from the depths of the world. It was as if some sort of power or creature that was completely targeted at the source of destruction had begun to gradually bring the source of destruction into the balance of the entire world, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. Although all of this was not completed in the blink of an eye like before, the speed at which it was completed was still rather impressive. Unknowingly, a new balance and a new world had been completely formed. When the new balance was formed, the appearance of this world had completely changed. From the outside, it looked like a sun that had been gradually extinguished had been lit up again. In the end, it emitted a completely different light that was much dimmer than before. It also seemed to have a certain mystery to it, and it seemed to have more substance than before. Furthermore, compared to the stable sunlight from before, the light that the world gave off this time was more energetic and lively, as if it was undergoing countless unimaginable changes at every moment. If one had to compare it with a simple change, it felt like the light that was constantly extinguishing and being lit up at every moment. The Creator of the world's expression became relaxed at this moment. At the same time, there was an indescribable reluctance in his eyes. The influence of the tribulations on the perfect world had been resisted. He did not even need to further stimulate the foundation of the world. He only needed to slightly stimulate a part of it, and it would be enough to completely neutralize the tribulations, preventing them from destroying the world further. This situation was naturally a good thing for the world to be in good condition. After all, the world was safe and would not really fall into complete destruction. From this point of view, it was naturally enough for him to feel relaxed. However, at the same time, from the perspective of opportunity, this situation meant that the tribulations were not enough for the perfect world to truly break through its limit. It was not enough for the perfect world to transcend the perfection that had been shackling it for countless trillions of years. From this point of view, it was enough for him to feel extremely unwilling. Why didn't the tribulations come more violently? The Creator of the world sighed and looked up at the source of all the changes. It was the tribulations that had unknowingly covered his world again. How could the Creator of the world not know about the existence of the tribulations after dealing with it so many times? However, ever since this world passed through the seventh great tribulation of the heavens and earth and became a perfect world that simulated the state of chaos, the tribulations were no longer able to affect it, and they couldn't bring further tribulations onto it. So it had stopped covering this world billions of years ago. At this moment, due to some unknown influence that the Creator of the world did not know, the tribulations had actually covered this world again and brought it into the range of the tribulations again. How could the creator of the world not be tempted? Perhaps I can take the initiative? The creator of the world suddenly had such a thought. Along with this thought, countless thoughts, ideas, and possibilities began to emerge in his heart. If it was any other creator of the world, even if such a thought appeared, it would be instantly discarded by their rationality. After all, taking the initiative to provoke the tribulations and guide the tribulations to descend was simply courting death. However, the creator of the perfect world was clearly not the same as the other creators of the world. For the creator of the perfect world, the boundless tribulations were already enough for him. Anything that was different from the boundless tribulations, even if it was just a simple disaster, would be quite attractive to him. Not to mention that it was a chance to surpass the completion of the world that he had created for billions of years. Even if there was only a 1 in a billion chance of success by taking the initiative to guide the tribulations, he would definitely not turn back. After all, to him, even the destruction of the world was actually a rather interesting experience. Therefore, when this thought appeared in his heart, he could no longer erase it from his heart. This thought was like a maggot in his tarsal bone, and he could no longer get rid of it. Instead, it began to expand and grow stronger. Very soon, he had completely made up his mind. "Come on, let me see how much of a challenge you can bring me," the creator of the world murmured. Countless chains began to rush out of his perfect world. As they collapsed, they advanced, and they constantly approached the tribulations. These chains were the mystical existences formed from the laws, and other abstract existences of this world. They themselves could even be regarded as some sort of projection or incarnation of this world. At this moment, when these chains rushed out of the world, it was obvious that they had entered a simulated state of chaos. When they entered the simulated state of chaos, they would obviously have to suffer the impact, pressure, corrosion, and other effects of the simulated state of chaos. Such an effect was obviously a disaster for these chains. Therefore, they would continuously collapse as they advanced. In fact, it was fortunate that the world was powerful enough, and its foundation was strong enough, so it could continuously reform the chains as they collapsed and continuously replenish the consumption with its own foundation. Of course, this was also due to the radiation of the perfect world. Because of the radiation of the perfect world, everything that could be seen in the perfect world could actually be considered to have established a connection with this world that was similar to a simulated state of chaos. The tribulations could also be seen in the perfect world, so it also had the same characteristic. Chapter 28:15. As the chains were constantly being created and destroyed, they continued to advance towards the tribulation layer. Unknowingly, they had already pierced into the tribulation layer. The moment the chains pierced into the tribulation layer, the boundless power of the tribulation surged madly through the chains towards this part of the world. For the tribulation layer, the task was to test the world, destroy the world, test the simulated chaos layer, destroy the simulated chaos layer, and everything else. Such an existence obviously wouldn't measure what should be tested and what shouldn't be tested like the simulated chaos layer. To it, as long as anything met the conditions to trigger the power of the tribulation layer would definitely not be stingy with the power of the tribulation. It would definitely send the endless power of the tribulation to the target at the first possible moment. As for the existence that guided the tribulation power, it naturally wouldn't care whether the target should encounter the tribulation power or not. It wouldn't care whether the target had just passed the tribulation or had already passed all the tribulations. It was the same for this perfect world. Even though it had already passed through all 7 great tribulations, it still couldn't do anything about it. In the simulated chaos layer, there should have been no tribulation, but when the world took the initiative to guide the tribulation power didn't relax even though it was already perfect. On the contrary, because this world had not experienced any tribulations for a long time, it was already empty, so it pounced even more ferociously. It even actively used the power of the tribulations to maintain the chains in the layers of tribulations, causing the chains to stop being destroyed after they pierced into the layers of tribulations. It was like a stable passageway for the tribulations, allowing the endless power of the tribulations to pour into the perfect world through the chains. Boom, a loud explosion seemed to have spread throughout the simulated chaos layer in an instant. Everything within the range of the perfect world felt the violent tremors of the perfect world at the same time. The endless tribulation power simply looked like it was flowing out of a hole at the bottom of a swimming pool. It surged down frantically and poured into the perfect world. The speed was so fast that it far exceeded the imagination of the creator of this world. In the blink of an eye, more than half of the world was drowned by the terrifying tribulation, compared to the seventh tribulation of heaven and earth he had experienced billions of years ago. This speed was more than 1,000 times faster. All right. Only such a tribulation can allow me to break through my limits. The creator of heaven and earth had almost gone crazy. At this moment, he wasn't worried at all. Instead, he was extremely excited. At this moment, the foundation of this world began to surge out in a frenzy. Boundless and terrifying life force instantly poured into every corner of the world, starting to support the world from its root. It allowed every corner of the world to gain powerful resistance, and began to resist the corrosion of the tribulations. It was easier to invite the gods in than to send them away. It was easier to guide the power of the tribulations to descend upon the world. However, the difficulty of completely expelling the power of the tribulation was practically limitless. As the power of the tribulation grew stronger, and purer, the creator of the world finally had a bad feeling. He wanted to sever the connection between the tribulation level and the world around him, and in other words, the chains that bound the world together. But it was a pity that the control of the chains was in the hands of the tribulation level. No matter how hard he tried, no matter how he targeted the weaknesses of the chains, he couldn't shake them. The chains were still the same as before, maintaining the connection between this region and the tribulation level, carrying the endless power of the tribulation that was constantly pouring into this region. In just a few breaths, the entire world was completely submerged by the power of the tribulations. As mentioned before, the tribulation layer wouldn't choose its own target. In this way, it also represented another fact. That was, it didn't attack the perfect world before. It was only because of the influence of the other simulation of the primal chaos that the tribulation layer couldn't cover this perfect world. If it wasn't for that, the changes that Luo Fan had caused to the tribulation layer wouldn't have attracted the tribulation so easily. After all, the tribulation and immeasurable of the perfect world wasn't just for show. The reason why the power of the tribulation could be drawn so quickly was because the tribulation layer was peeking at the perfect world at all times, trying its best to bring the tribulation to the perfect world at all times. However, the changes that Luo Fan triggered in that power were ultimately limited, so the perfect world's tribulation and immeasurable characteristics quickly suppressed the power of the tribulation layer. That was why the perfect world only encountered the power of the tribulation that was between tribulation and mutation. However, the creator of the perfect world wasn't satisfied with this kind of tribulation. He actually used the mechanism of the world to communicate with the tribulation layer and guided the power of the tribulation to descend upon the world. This was simply like sending food to his mouth. How could the tribulation layer be polite to the perfect world? Stop! The creator of the perfect world had already woken up. He let out a furious roar and released a terrifying might from the depths of the world. In the blink of an eye, it swept through every inch of the world and spread out along the chain. In the blink of an eye, it affected the tribulation level at the end of the chain. This terrifying power was enough to wash away everything. Even the power of the tribulation would be greatly affected by this terrifying power. At this moment, the entire world fell silent. Even the endless power of the tribulations that was pouring down from the tribulation level and pouring into the world also paused for a moment at this moment. At this moment, the chains that connected the heavens and the earth to the tribulations began to emit cracking sounds, as though some sort of power was destroying the chains from within. Countless cracks gradually appeared on the surface of the chains. They were so densely packed that they looked like countless tiny veins. They covered every inch of the chains, making them look even more profound and unfathomable. The Creator of the heaven and earth furrowed his brows deeply at this moment. Just as he was about to increase the power, he suddenly discovered that the power of the tribulation was even more violent than before. It instantly erupted from the tribulation layer and began to frantically pour into the chains. In the blink of an eye, it had completely poured into the end of the chains, where the world was located. The terrifying power that erupted from the depths of the world was instantly defeated by the power of the tribulation. All the effects caused by the power were completely reversed and disappeared without a trace. At this moment, the power of the tribulation that poured into the world from the tribulation layer was simply too much, and it was too fast. As the power of the tribulation continued to pour in, a mysterious vortex gradually appeared above the tribulation layer. The vortex spun slowly, and the boundless power of tribulations shrank along with the vortex, pouring into the chain, and then into the perfect world through the chain. It's over. At this moment, this was the only thought in the Creator of the heaven and earth's mind. The power of the tribulation continued to seep into the depths of the world. This time, the foundation of the world no longer needed the Creator of the heaven and earth's guidance. The foundation that had been accumulated for an unknown number of trillions of years was stimulated by the power of the tribulations. It surged out madly from the depths of the world, and as it continued to erupt, it tried its best to neutralize the effects of the tribulations on the world. From this, one could see how powerful the foundation that this world had accumulated was. Even if the tribulation layer continued to pour the power of the tribulation into the world and seemed to have completely covered this world, to the point that it had even seeped into the depths of the world, there would still be occasional flashes of light in this world. Occasionally, this part of the world that was within its range would be lit up again, turning into the appearance of the sun. Although this sun-like appearance would soon be suppressed and replaced by the dim light, this was already shocking enough. One must know that what it was facing could be considered the entire tribulation layer. Facing the endless support of the tribulation layer and the boundless power of the tribulation, this world could still turn around from time to time and suppress the power of the tribulation, allowing the world to return to its original state. This was enough to show how unbelievable the foundation of this world was. Of course, all of this was only temporary. Victory was only a temporary victory. After all, in terms of the overall foundation, this world was far from being comparable to the tribulation layer. One must know that the tribulation layer was an entire layer, while this world was just a world. Even if this world was a perfect world that had survived 7 major world tribulations, it was still just a world. With such a difference in size, it would be a huge underestimation of the tribulation level even if one used the largest number to measure it. Sometimes, a person's size represented a person's foundation. It was like 2 countries. One was the size of half a planet with a population of tens of billions. The other was the size of a village with a population of less than 100 people. It went without saying how great the difference in the foundation of the 2 countries was. For a country with a population of tens of billions, just a small portion of it to travel to another country for a few years would be enough to assimilate that country in a situation where the chains couldn't be severed. The final outcome of the perfect world was already fixed. All the struggles of this perfect world were merely prolonging the time it would take for the final result to descend. The stronger the struggle, the later the arrival of the final outcome would be. The more perfunctory the struggle, the earlier the arrival of the final outcome would be. That was all. It was precisely because of this that the creator of the perfect world felt despair. However, the creator of the perfect world was extremely extraordinary to be able to create a world from zero to the level of a perfect world. This despair didn't linger in his heart for too long. Soon, he regrouped and regained his fighting spirit. He began to work hard to think of a way to reverse this hopeless outcome. The only feasible way was to break the chain. As long as the chain was broken, he was confident that his world could survive this tribulation even if the world was in an extremely bad situation. He was confident that his world could recover from this tribulation, even if he had to pay a huge price. The creator of the perfect world pondered for 100 years. At the very least, it had been 100 years for this perfect world. During these 100 years, the tribulation level was still endless. Could it be that the endless power of the tribulation was channeled into the perfect world through the chain? The tribulation power in the perfect world was doing everything it could to destroy this world. It was trying its best to eliminate everything in this world, to destroy all life in this world and even the world itself. However, in the face of such a bad situation, the perfect world resisted it by relying on the foundation that it had accumulated over billions of years. The entire world seemed to be filled with the flames of war and ruins. Even the world itself seemed to have been broken countless times before being pieced back together. There were traces of destruction everywhere. However, this world didn't collapse completely. It still stubbornly existed in the simulated state of chaos. There were even all sorts of feedback powers being transmitted into the tribulation level, spreading out along with the boundless power of the tribulation level. There was even an insignificant small portion that was transmitted to the depths of the tribulation level, where the power related to the true sage was. Chapter 28:16. As he made his decision, indescribable changes began to take place in the depths of the perfect world. Amidst the changes, strands of extremely subtle existences were constantly extracted and gathered towards the creator of this world. It didn't take long for a thin layer of existence to form on the surface of the creator's body, making him illusory and ethereal. As these existences were continuously extracted, this perfect world seemed to have its backbone gradually removed, and it began to transform into another form at an unimaginable speed. That's right, it wasn't destruction, but transformation into another form. The power of the tribulations contained in this perfect world was simply too much. In terms of quantity, even the power of the seventh great tribulation of the heavens and earth was not as great as 100 millionth of this great tribulation of the heavens and earth. Such a terrifying power of the tribulations was enough to trigger a qualitative change. Under the endless accumulation of the power of the tribulations, the moment this world lost its ability to resist, everything within it was almost completely assimilated by the power of the tribulations, causing the nature of the world to gradually undergo all sorts of subtle and unfathomable changes. In the end, this world seemed to have turned into a state similar to a tribulations world. Of course, it was only similar, and it was still fundamentally different from a true tribulations world. Moreover, the transformation had yet to be completed. There was still a part of the world that resisted, and it was still struggling to maintain this world from being completely transformed. To the outside world, this process would only take a few breaths. However, compared to the inside of the world, the entire process would probably take years. In the end, when the creator of this world extracted everything he wanted to extract, nearly 10 years had passed. At this moment, the creator of this world no longer had the feeling of being one with this world. On the contrary, it gradually gave birth to all sorts of indescribable feelings of incompatibility. It was as if the relationship between the two had been completely severed. At this moment, the chains that extended from the heavens and earth and pierced through the simulated chaos into the tribulation level gradually began to change. In the blink of an eye, the many chains began to gradually shrink, as if there was a force constantly pulling on the chains from the other end. The direction they were pulling in wasn't towards the world, but towards the tribulation layer. Along with that, the appearance of the tribulation layer had almost completely changed, and it had almost completely transformed into a perfect world similar to the tribulation world. It was clear that the tribulation layer was gradually devouring this world in an extremely strange way. The concept of time in the simulated chaos was completely different from the concept of time in an ordinary world. The pulling process was extremely long in the eyes of the creator of this world, but in the eyes of the other creators, this change happened in an instant. By the time they reacted, the perfect world that had changed had completely disappeared from the tribulation layer. This is destroyed? The creators of this world were all horrified. They didn't expect this to happen. One must know that the perfect world was the goal of all the creators of this world. For the creators of a perfect world, it wasn't a good thing for the world they created to be perfect and without any tribulations. On the contrary, it would make them feel that they had no goal to strive for and couldn't see the direction to improve. It was a state that needed to be broken. However, for the creators of this world that hadn't reached perfection, this perfect world was practically the highest achievement they could see in the simulated chaos. It was the strongest goal they could find here. Even in their dreams, any world would want their world to become a perfect world. But now, they could sense that the perfect world had been destroyed by the tribulation in the blink of an eye. It was so much so that they didn't even have the time to react before it was destroyed by the tribulation. This situation was a huge blow to them, and it was self-evident. If a perfect world was so weak and powerless before the tribulation, then was it still worth pursuing? Such a blow was a blow to their beliefs and hearts. For the creators of this world, such a blow was clearly the most severe and unbearable. No, that's not right. If it's really destroyed, why can I still sense that region? Suddenly, some of the creators reacted and knew that something was wrong. This simulated primal chaos state was incomparably mysterious. If one wanted to observe anything outside of the world in this simulated primal chaos state, they actually didn't rely on perception or vision. Instead, they relied on the mutual influence between them. In other words, they could see other worlds in the simulated chaos because the worlds they saw had some influence on them. Only the existence of such an influence could point out the existence of that world and the possible state of that world's existence. In reality, everything that the founders of the world saw outside the world was not the true appearance of everything outside the world. Instead, it was just an image that they built in their hearts based on the impact that everything outside the world had on the world and on themselves. In other words, strictly speaking, it was just a hallucination in their hearts. Of course, this was also the only way to observe other worlds in the simulated chaos. It did not mean that what they saw was an illusion or a mistake. Previously, they had been able to observe and sense the perfect world because the perfect world had some kind of influence on their world, and it also had some kind of influence on them. This was because the perfect world was extremely lofty and had an extremely strong influence on most of the worlds in the simulated chaos. This was why the perfect world was like a sun in the eyes of the creators who could observe it. But now, the perfect world had clearly been destroyed by the tribulation, and there was nothing left. According to the principle of observation, they should not be able to see the scene where the perfect world was. That place should not exist in their eyes at all. However, at this moment they still discovered that they could still see that region. Compared to before, when the perfect world still existed, although it was much more blurry and illusory, they could still see it. It was completely different from those regions that they couldn't see, which were completely dark. Is it a remnant, or is the perfect world just existing in a different form? Such doubts flashed through the creator's mind. For the creator of this world, he was naturally looking forward to the second possibility, which was the possibility that the perfect world was just existing in a different form. At the very least, if that was the case, his faith would not completely collapse, and the perfect world would not be as useless as he saw it. Of course, the creator of this world was not an ordinary person. Although he was looking forward to the second possibility, he would not completely ignore the first one. At that moment, he used all kinds of methods to connect with the perfect world in an attempt to re-establish a connection with it. The perfect world had been perfect for billions of trillions of years. During such a long time, the creator of this perfect world naturally could not just limit himself to the inside of the world. Instead, out of boredom, he researched many ways to connect with other worlds. Then, with the advantage of his level as a perfect world, he became the de facto ruler of the world. These worlds that were within the range of its radiation were naturally worlds that were naturally dominated by it. In this dominant process, many methods of communication between the heavens and earth were naturally created. The method that the creator of this world used was one of these methods. This kind of connection was like a clay ox entering the sea, and he did not get any feedback. There were quite a few worlds that the creator of this world had chosen similar to this one. After all, the creators of this world were quite extraordinary existences, especially the ones who could overcome tribulation after tribulation and finally come to a place so close to the perfect world. Naturally, it was impossible for other creators of this world to not notice what the creator of this world could think of. It was naturally impossible for the many worlds that were ruled by the perfect world to not have any connection. After all, they were all workers working under the same boss, so how could there be no communication between them? At this moment, many worlds were contacting each other to discuss the current situation. Although there were all kinds of problems in the world at this moment, such as encountering tribulations, suddenly and strangely interrupting tribulations, or strange changes in tribulations, and so on. In the past, these kinds of situations were naturally enough for them to completely ignore everything in the outside world, and only focus their attention on the inside of their own world. However, at this moment, the problem was what they were fighting for, and where their beliefs lay. This kind of influence could even determine how they would develop in the future, determine their future choices, and even determine whether they would need to pay a price to overcome the tribulations. Such a great influence was enough to suppress the changes that occurred in their world, and it was enough for them to focus almost all their attention on the perfect world at this moment. The flow of time between the many worlds was quite different. Normally speaking, the connections between the worlds would not be too frequent. Even if they had to contact each other, they would try to delay the contact as much as possible and would not directly contact each other immediately. After all, you might need decades or even centuries to respond to my words. You might even have already responded to my words in the past. In such a strange state, it was obviously very inconvenient to communicate with each other in real time. In contrast, using delayed methods such as letters or emails to contact each other was also a little inconvenient, but it was naturally much more convenient than instant communication. However, at this moment, when faced with matters related to their beliefs, even if it was inconvenient, they could only use instant communication. I didn't get any response. Me neither. I didn't get any response either. The first thing that the many creators of this world communicated with each other was whether they had received any response. This kind of communication was actually a kind of exchange. They exchanged their own experiences for the experiences of other creators of this world. They hoped to be able to hear the information they wanted to hear from the mouth of any other creator of this world. However, it was a pity that things did not go as smoothly as they thought. None of the creators received any response from the perfect world's creator. That place was completely empty, like an invisible void that devoured all information, all senses, all gazes. Perhaps it's just a remnant. One of the creators let out an inexplicable sigh and retracted his attention back to the world that was suffering a disaster. He had already given up on the possibility of the second possibility existing. The other creators also sighed inwardly and refocused their attention back to themselves. He admitted that the perfect world was not a transformation, but a remnant that was left behind. This was clearly a huge blow to their enthusiasm. While the pioneers were exploring the place where the perfect world had disappeared, there was a figure shrouded in an indescribable light floating in the simulated state of chaos. That figure was naturally the perfect world's creator of this world. The light around his body was naturally the things that the creator of this world had forcibly grabbed from the perfect world. At this moment, the creator of this world was sitting cross-legged and shrouded in light, giving off a sacred and dignified aura. Chapter 28:17. In fact, what was condensed around the world creator was his worldview. It was a worldview that belonged to him and was completely different from other living beings and existences. This worldview should have only been an illusory existence, and it should have existed as long as the world creator did not die. However, time could change everything. For ordinary world creators, this was their worldview. However, the situation was completely different for the creator of the world, who had completed the world. As the perfect world went through the world's calamities again and again, the world creator's worldview also fused with the world that he had created. This fusion caused his worldview to unknowingly become an inseparable part of the perfect world. If he did not separate his worldview from the world, then once the world creator left that world, what awaited him would be a long period of time where he would completely lose his worldview, and he would not be able to use the unique worldview that he had spent countless trillions of years to establish. This situation seemed unbelievable, but in fact it was common for ordinary people. It was just like when a person repeatedly did something for a long period of time, day and night, without stopping, for several days and nights, a few years, or even a few decades. Even if it was something that he was interested in, he would inevitably develop feelings of boredom. Under this feeling of fatigue, once he stopped the repetitive process, he would definitely be extremely reluctant to continue repeating it for a short period of time. What happened to the world creator was similar to this. It was just that compared to the experience of ordinary people, his experience was more profound and abstract, and the way it was affected was more mysterious. Of course, in reality, this did not mean that the worldview had completely disappeared. The worldview was still at the bottom of the world creator's heart, and it was still in the depths of his memories. Once he had enough time, it would not be a problem for him to condense it into a complete worldview again. However, that would require an incomparably long amount of time. The situation now was clearly different. Because he had separated his worldview from the perfect world, he did not need the perfect world as a support, and his worldview could already maintain the appearance of a complete worldview. That way, once he left the perfect world, he would naturally be able to use his worldview directly. In fact, if he were to use the experience of ordinary people as an analogy, it would be equivalent to him stopping an action that had been repeated for years or even decades, and he was already prepared to start again. He clearly knew that he was not really stopping, but was just taking a short break. In this way, it would be easy for him to repeat this action again in the future. At this moment, there were endless, unimaginable, and mysterious existences constantly surging out of the world creator's body. Together with the simulated chaotic state outside, they enriched the mysterious light around his body, causing the light to expand even faster and transform into the appearance of the world. The mysterious existences that surged out of his body were none other than the foundation that he had plundered from the perfect world when he split his worldview. They were the foundation that the perfect world had accumulated over countless trillions of years. These resources existed in various forms, and after they appeared, they brought endless benefits to the growth of this world. They shortened the time it took for this world to take shape by 10 times. After an unknown period of time, when the world creator returned to his senses, he found that he was already in a different world. Without destruction, there can be no construction. This might be an opportunity. Looking at the world that was billions of times weaker than the perfect world, the world creator smiled bitterly and could only comfort himself in this way. This part of the world was actually much stronger than the worlds created by ordinary world creators. However, compared to his perfect world, it was insignificant. For the world creator, who was used to the perfect world, the difference was so great that it almost made him lose his mental balance. Of course, it was only almost. After all, he was the world creator that could nurture a perfect world, so he quickly regained his mental balance. At this moment, his world was only equivalent to a world that had yet to trigger its first great tribulation. However, because his worldview had fused with the perfect world, it was already extremely compatible with the simulated chaotic state and the world that had undergone the tribulation. Therefore, compared to an ordinary world that had yet to undergo a great tribulation, the foundation of this world was many times better. For a world like this, if it wanted to undergo a great tribulation, it was actually just a matter of when it would descend. There was no need to worry about whether it could be passed. Just as the creator of this world was deep in thought, the signs of a tribulation suddenly appeared in his senses. What's going on? The world creator was slightly taken aback. This situation did not conform to the normal rules. It must be known that he, who had survived 7 great tribulations of the world, had a deep understanding of the rules of the great tribulations of the world. According to his understanding of the rules of the great tribulations of the world, it would normally take tens of thousands of years of development for the world to reach the level of triggering the first great tribulation of the world. But now, his world had just taken shape, and the great tribulation of heaven and earth was already following closely behind. He could not help but feel a strong sense of uneasiness. Could it be that the previous tribulation didn't disappear with the body and is following me? Thinking of this possibility, he broke out in cold sweat. The previous tribulation that the perfect world had encountered was a terrifying one that surpassed the 7th great tribulation by countless times. Even his original perfect heaven and earth had no choice but to abandon his body in the face of such a tribulation. If such a tribulation followed him to this world that had not even survived a great tribulation of the world, was there any need to say what kind of ending awaited this world? He dared to say that if that sort of tribulation really followed, then this world and himself would probably be wiped clean at the first possible moment. Fortunately, things had not reached a state that made the world creator despair. Although the great tribulation had strangely descended, its level was ultimately not that much higher than the first great tribulation. For this world, it was not too difficult to deal with it. Looks like I've passed. After measuring the level of the great tribulation, the world creator finally heaved a sigh of relief. With that, he turned to look at the sky, at the place where his perfect world had disappeared. After all, he had nurtured that world for billions of years. How could he not feel sad about giving it up just like that? Just what kind of existence caused all these changes? He thought to himself with a bitter expression. When the world creator restarted, a small portion of the world creators that were originally within the range of the perfect world discovered the existence of this world. After all, this world itself was too small and insignificant. At the very least, compared to the worlds that had easily undergone the 6th and 5th Great Tribulation, it was so insignificant that they almost ignored it. If it was not for the fact that this world had appeared where the perfect world was, the existence of this world would definitely be completely ignored by all the world creators. However, even if only a small portion of the world's founders noticed the existence of this world, its existence would no longer be a secret. It did not take long for the many world creators to know of its existence. All sorts of inexplicable probing began to come towards this world from all directions. As an existence that stood above many worlds, the perfect world was naturally not completely friendly to the other worlds that were within its range of influence. However, it was inevitable for it to look down on others. When the perfect world was originally high and mighty and had an absolute position, the world creators naturally did not have any objections. However, once the perfect world fell and lost its high and mighty position, these various attitudes became the source of the negative emotions in the hearts of the world creators. Therefore, at this moment, they were facing the small world that was likely to have fallen from the perfect world, and all of them harbored all sorts of unfathomable thoughts. Once the results of the probing were revealed, the fate of this world would be worth considering. It could be said that this region was almost like the mouth of a volcano. Perhaps this volcano would erupt at any time, causing this simulated chaotic state to fall into another kind of tribulation. Of course, all of this did not affect the tribulation level at all. In contrast, it was the perfect world that was thrown into the tribulation level that was causing more and more serious effects on the tribulation level. Previously, the world creators had only extracted a small portion of the perfect world's worldview and an insignificant foundation from the perfect world. Compared to the world that had yet to undergo a single tribulation, this kind of foundation was naturally huge, and it was enough for the world to easily pass through the first, second, and even third tribulation. However, it was nothing compared to the perfected heaven and earth's almost limitless foundation. Since the foundation that was taken away was only an insignificant part of the perfect heaven and earth's foundation, then where did the remaining almost infinite foundation go? Evidently, the nearly infinite foundation had been completely thrown into the tribulation level along with the body of the perfect world. The perfected heavens and earth was naturally insignificant compared to the tribulation level. However, the perfected heavens and earth had clearly reached the pinnacle in the primal chaos simulation. In other words, as long as the world existed in the simulated chaotic state, no matter if it was created by the world creators, or born from the simulated chaotic state, or formed due to various other factors, it could not be compared to the perfect world. Such a perfect world was assimilated and devoured by the tribulation level, so it was self-evident how great the impact it would be. In an instant, the entire tribulation level had completely changed. Although there wasn't much difference on the surface, the turbulence that had gradually calmed down due to Luo Fan's true saint-related power was stirred up once again the moment the world charged in. It was as though the input of the world had stirred up countless undercurrents in the tribulation level, causing the interior of the tribulation level to become incomparably chaotic. The boundless power of the tribulations continued to pour into the former perfect world, seeping into it and transforming it, assimilating it, gradually turning it into an inseparable part of the tribulation layer, an extremely important part. Compared to an ordinary world, the key to the perfect world was the word perfection. In terms of level, there wasn't much difference between a world that had gone through the sixth and seventh major tribulation. At most, the difference was only a few dozen times or a few hundred times. Such a difference wasn't insurmountable for any creator of the world. However, if a world that had gone through the sixth major tribulation and a perfect world were placed together, the difference between the two would be enough to make anyone despair. Even if tens of thousands of worlds that had gone through the sixth major tribulation were placed together, they wouldn't be as precious as a perfect world. The reason for such a change was because of the perfection of the world that had gone through the seventh major tribulation. Because it was perfection, the world that had gone through the seventh major tribulation had absolute peak characteristics in this simulated chaotic state. Because it was perfection, it had infinite capacity here. Chapter 28:19. After the projection appeared, Luo Fan suddenly felt that his body had become inexplicably heavy. This kind of heavy feeling was quite strange. It was not the kind of heaviness that came from carrying a heavy burden. Instead, it was a kind of heaviness that seemed to be beyond his control. It was as if his current understanding of this body was still superficial and he did not understand the various deep secrets of this body at all. This feeling was both familiar and strange to him. Back when he was still an ordinary person, he had this feeling all the time. When he had just transmigrated to the untainted land, he also had this feeling. This feeling only disappeared when he had achieved success in his cultivation and was able to fully control and understand his body. However, now, this familiar yet strange feeling appeared again. This situation made him feel a little indescribable for a moment. I didn't expect such a trace of power to have such a mysterious characteristic. As expected, everything related to a true divine is extraordinary. Luo Fan thought to himself at this moment, and his expression became a little strange. With this thought in mind, his body swayed, and he had already left the core of this world. Although this incarnation itself had all kinds of deep secrets that he did not know, and it was even difficult for him to dig out even if he tried his best, the strength of this projection was not reduced at all because of this. For Luo Fan, the strength of this projection was still comparable to his original body. Under such circumstances, with the help of this body, he could naturally do countless incredible things. Obviously, directly crossing the space to leave the core of this world was a small matter that did not need to be said at all. After appearing outside the core of this world, Luo Fan looked over and saw a vast and boundless world imprinted in his eyes. At this moment, this world seemed to have just experienced some kind of extremely tragic calamity. The entire world was filled with traces of destruction. There were all sorts of battlefields everywhere, and there were also endless ruins everywhere. All of this was laid out, and Luo Fan knew what was going on at one glance. It has experienced the great tribulation of the world. Looks like this is a world that was experiencing the great tribulation of the world, but for some reason, it was devoured and assimilated by the tribulation layer. He thought to himself, even though the world before him was filled with traces of impending calamities and ruins of battles, it didn't mean that this world was deathly still. In fact, even though the nature of this world had undergone an earth-shattering change, and it seemed to have transformed into a world of tribulation, the entire world was still full of vitality. Even though the essence of all the living beings in this world had changed, and they had become existences that relied on the power of tribulations, their appearances had barely changed at all. It was still the same as it was outside the tribulation level. How they survived in the past was how they survived now. Everything was the same as before. It gave people the feeling that the entire world had only shifted its position, and the nature of the world itself had not changed at all. Seeing this, Luo Fan's eyes lit up. To him, this kind of income couldn't be better. He wanted to explore the secrets of this world. He wanted to know why the power related to the true divine was so interested in this world. He wanted to know the reason why this world gave up the excellent position in the depths of the calamity level and chose this world as his place of residence. If there were no living creatures in this world and only ruins were left, then the only thing he could do if he wanted to know about this kind of thing was to be an archaeologist and do archaeology everywhere in this world. But now there were still countless living beings in this world. In that case, he could obviously bypass many of the original problems through these living beings and easily learn many secrets about this world. The benefits were so great that it went without saying. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart moved slightly. The incarnation condensed slightly, and it had already transformed from its original illusory appearance into a real body of flesh and blood. This was not because the power related to the true divine that had formed his body had become much stronger. Instead, it was because at this moment, he directly gathered the endless power of the outside world around his projection, using the essence of his projection to suppress this power, causing it to solidify there. Only then did his body become as solid as it could be. Strictly speaking, what he did at this moment was actually equivalent to putting another piece of clothing on his projection. Although this world did not seem to have changed much, after all, it had undergone earth-shattering changes, and even its nature was completely different from before. Therefore, in this world, the original appearance of the born Taoism aptitude had already been unknowingly eliminated. Now, the connate Taoism aptitude that was originally a perfect world had completely lost its original advantages or privileges in this world. For the current world, the appearance of any living being could be said to be born Taoism aptitude, but it could also be said to be not born Taoism aptitude. At this moment, Luo Fan's human form could also receive the blessing of the world in this world, and he could also obtain the most perfect growth like the born Taoism aptitude. Of course, from another point of view, perhaps this also meant that he was also mediocre. However, all of this was meaningless to the current Luo Fan. Right now, Luo Fan needed to figure out the secrets of this world. Of course, it would be best if he could figure out the secret of this projection in the process. In contrast, in this world, using the various advantages and privileges of this world to cultivate was not within his scope of consideration. In this way, becoming mediocre in this world because of one's physique was not an unacceptable situation. After leaving the core, he could be anywhere in this world. Before this, Luo Fan had actually already considered the direction of his action. Therefore, after leaving the core, he did not appear in the wilderness, but in the vicinity of a city. From this location, he could see an extremely vast city not too far away at a glance. The city was now filled with traces of battle, and there were ruins everywhere. The living beings in the city were busy tidying up the ruins and rebuilding the city. There were also quite a few experts in this city. Among them, there were naturally no experts who could truly catch Luo Fan's attention, who could enlighten Luo Fan, and who could truly make him admire them. However, in this world, there were quite a number of experts who could be called experts when it came to the transformation and destruction of the world. At the very least, at this moment, the speed at which the entire city recovered from the state of ruins to a perfect state was rather fast with the help of those experts. From the looks of it, the entire city would probably look brand new in a few days at most. As mentioned before, the appearance of the creator of this world was extremely contrary to Luo Fan's aesthetic standards. If it had not been for the perfect characteristics brought about by the born Taoism aptitude, Luo Fan was afraid that he would directly treat him as a monster now. Although the perfect characteristics brought about by the born Taoism aptitude had disappeared, the aesthetic standards of the living beings in this world had long been formed. Under such aesthetic standards, living beings that did not conform to the monstrous appearance were all ugly. In their eyes, the appearance of those monstrous creatures was beautiful and worthy of longing. At this moment, the appearance of Luo Fan was clearly in the range of that ugly category. Of course, although Luo Fan's figure was not considered a born Taoism aptitude in this world, it was still a born Taoism aptitude that belonged to a certain world. Under such circumstances, this kind of body naturally contained a kind of balance, a kind of harmony, and even a kind of perfection and perfection. Of course, this kind of perfection and perfection could not be fully displayed because of the world, but just the first few parts were enough to make his appearance look highly upon. Even if they felt that Luo Fan's figure was ugly, it was the kind of ugliness that was adorably ugly. If all of this was combined with the unbelievable ability that Luo Fan possessed at this moment, it was enough for all living beings to not be able to ignore his existence. At this moment, Luo Fan chose the strongest expert in this city. In a flash, he had already appeared in front of the strongest expert. This strongest expert was originally working hard to help this city rebuild. He exerted his strength to clean up the ruins of this city, then reconstructed the various things that were cleared out of the ruins and reformed them into brand new buildings. Faced with the sudden arrival of Luo Fan, the living being's body trembled. What existence dares to be so arrogant in front of me? The language that this voice used was naturally a language that Luo Fan was completely unfamiliar with. However, this language was clearly not an obstacle for him at all. For the current him, it was almost instinctive for him to instantly receive the message in those words. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and said, You should be able to sense that this world has changed, right? Tell me everything you feel. He only used the language that he was familiar with, and it was also a language that the living being before him had never heard before. However, he believed that the living being would definitely be able to understand what he was saying, and would definitely not misunderstand because of the language. Hearing this, the living being sneered and said, "You're indeed arrogant enough. If you want me to cooperate with you, then show me your strength." There was no doubt that this living being was a powerful expert. As a powerful expert, he naturally had his own pride. Although the method that Luo Fan used to appear before him was difficult for him to understand, it seemed that Luo Fan had displayed greater strength and more brilliant methods than he had. However, before he truly tried, even if Luo Fan's strength was thousands of times greater than his, he would definitely not give up just like that. This was the pride of a powerful expert. It could even be called a lofty and unyielding character. However, Luo Fan smiled and said, "That's reasonable. Are you ready?" The living being was suddenly alarmed. As his body trembled, he suddenly felt an unimaginable power instantly suppress his body. He felt as if his entire body was suddenly completely suppressed, and he could not even tremble, let alone move. At this moment, the powerful expert truly felt Luo Fan's strength. Only then did he realize how much he had courted death just now. Perhaps Luo Fan's earlier action was close to a sneak attack in the eyes of ordinary people, but the living being was very clear that no matter how much preparation he had made, he could not possibly resist such a terrifying suppression. In other words, whether or not the other party had launched a sneak attack, the result would not change at all. Just from this suppression alone, there was no need to doubt the other party's strength. At the very least, the other party had the right to use that tone to interrogate him. After suppressing the expert for a while, Luo Fan watched as the expert's power surged crazily. Even the sound of the expert's body being overwhelmed kept coming out, as if it was going to explode in the next moment. Only then did Luo Fan smiled faintly and slowly withdrew the power of suppression. He did not really want to suppress the living being before him, nor did he really want to erase this living being. If he wanted to achieve this goal, he did not need to do anything at all. In fact, he only needed to send a thought over, and the other party would collapse on their own and die on their own. The reason why he had displayed the other party's unstoppable suppression power was to make him yield, to let him know how powerful he was, to let him understand that he was already giving him a lot of face by asking him like this. At this moment, the living being's expression kept changing. In the end, he took a deep breath and said, "Senior, what do you want to know?" "I will tell you everything I know." Luo Fan smiled and nodded. "That's good. Then let's start from the origin of this world. I think you should know the origin of this world, right? I don't want the legendary origin. I want the real origin that can be proven." Chapter 28:20. To the living being, Luo Fan's existence was enough to dispel all of his wishful thinking. Therefore, he could only rack his brains and tell Lin Li everything he knew about the origin of the world. Of course, it was doubtful how true these possibilities were. However, because Luo Fan had said it first, he tried his best to find some plausible evidence no matter how ridiculous it sounded. He could not guarantee that the evidence was true, but at least based on the evidence, the possibility was established. As for the specific origin of this world, Luo Fan would have to figure it out himself. As he narrated, several days passed. Although the living being was as weak as an ant in front of Luo Fan and yielded to a simple threat from him, the truth was that he was the most powerful being in the city. However, in reality, he was definitely the strongest person in the city. The importance of this kind of strongest expert in this period of time, when the city was recovering from the ruins, was self-evident. It could be said that no matter what happened in this city, nothing could escape from him. How could the people in the city not know that he had suddenly lost contact with the outside world for a few days? Unknowingly, There were many inquisitive gazes around the residence of that expert. It was so much so that all sorts of channels to contact that expert were filled with requests to contact him. Fortunately, it had only been a few days. Although many living beings were anxious and doubtful, they did not do anything irrational and offended Luo Fan. However, because the time was still short, they did not make any irrational actions, nor did they really offend Luo Fan. However, because it had only been a short time, they did not act irrationally and offend Luo Fan. Luo Fan was too strong. Even he was just an ant in front of him. The other living beings could not even compare to him, let alone an ant among ants. Under such circumstances, if the other living beings were to take any irrational actions and offend the powerhouse before them, then what awaited them would be death without a burial site. Luo Fan didn't care about all of this. After all, to him, this city could not even withstand a slap from him. If it wasn't for the fact that he wanted to understand the secrets of this world and the nature of this world, he wouldn't have even thought about communicating with the creatures of this world. Under such circumstances, how could he care about the thoughts of the other residents in the city? How could he care about any actions they might take? As expected, this world was created by a creator. According to the legends of the world's creation, this world should have gone through 8 catastrophes. Luo Fan frowned as he carefully thought about what he had learned from the creature's words. Among the many legends about the origin of heaven and earth, there weren't many valuable ones. However, the truth was still hidden within the many legends. As long as the truth was hidden, with Luo Fan's ability, he would naturally be able to distinguish it. Therefore, in the end, he still figured out the true origin of this world through the many legends. This world was obviously created by a creator of heaven and earth. Before that, at least before the force related to a true sage entered this world, or rather, before this world entered the tribulation level, this world was no different from the other worlds in the simulated state of chaos. It was no different from his world of laws. Similarly, it resisted the simulated state of chaos in the simulated state of chaos to ensure the safety of the creator of this world. It also had all sorts of subtle connections with other worlds, and it was even possible for it to create a simulated state of chaos like his world of laws and become the master of that simulated state of chaos. However, the difference between this world and all the worlds that Luo Fan had known before was that this world had gone through 8 great tribulations before entering the tribulation level. No, perhaps it was the 7th tribulation of the heaven and earth. In the 8th tribulation of the heaven and earth, this world had obviously failed. The result of this failure was that it had been pulled into the tribulation level and completely turned into a part of the tribulation level. It had become an existence similar to the tribulation heaven and earth. Therefore, it had also attracted the interest of the power related to the true divine. 8 catastrophes. What's so special about these 8 catastrophes? Luo Fan pondered, only to feel that the fog in his heart was getting thicker and thicker. The number 8 was quite strange. If it was 7, it could still be linked to the number of catastrophes he had gone through. If it was 9, it would naturally be linked to the simulated state of chaos. However, 8 was a number that was neither too high nor too low, making it really difficult for him to figure out the secret behind it. With doubts in his heart, he began to ask about the previous situations of this world, such as the situation of each catastrophes, and the situation of this time's catastrophes. Although this creature was quite powerful, it was obviously not strong enough to personally experience the previous catastrophes. To him, the only catastrophes he had experienced were the 8 catastrophes that the creator of this world had taken the initiative to attract. He might have heard about the previous catastrophes, but he did not know if they were true. He did not understand the time interval between the catastrophes at all. In this way, his explanation of the Great Tribulation was naturally vague. Although it wasn't specious, it was still hard for Luo Fan to believe it. It was hard for Luo Fan to see the truth. According to what he said, there are no catastrophes in this world, but the time interval between them is unimaginably long. It's even up to billions of trillion years ago. This situation clearly doesn't make sense. The time interval between any two tribulations can't be so long, even if it's the 8th and 7th heaven and earth tribulations. Luo Fan thought in his heart, and he faintly came to a conclusion. Although the flow of time between the heavens and the earth was independent, and countless years passed in this world, only a few breaths had passed in another world. The time between the two catastrophes could not be extended indefinitely. Even if it was purely to accelerate the flow of time within the world, and only to give the world more time to develop between the two catastrophes, the time between the two catastrophes could not be infinite. Perhaps within a certain range, this time could be adjusted at any time, and it could develop according to the will of the creator of this world. However, that was clearly only within a certain range. Moreover, this range of time could not be too long. At the very least, it could not be as long as billions of trillion years. Therefore, either the legend was wrong, either that, or there was something wrong with the 7th and 8th heavenly tribulations of this world. Or, the 7th catastrophes triggered some sort of change that allowed this world to be free from the threat of the catastrophes for a long time. Or, the 8th catastrophes should not have existed in the first place, and it was only because of some special change that the 8th catastrophes appeared. Out of these two possibilities, which one was more likely to happen? Obviously, no matter how one thought about it, the second possibility was more likely. In other words, perhaps for this world, the 7th great tribulation of the heavens and earth was already perfect. In other words, the 7th catastrophes of this world should have been the last catastrophes of this world. After the 7th catastrophes, this world should have been eternally free from the threat of the catastrophes. However, due to some sort of change, perhaps due to the changes in the catastrophes, or perhaps because the creator of this world was courting death, the 8th catastrophes that should not have appeared. After that, the 8th tribulation of the world directly defeated this world and pulled it into the tribulation level, causing it to become an extremely strange world in the tribulation level that attracted the attention of the power related to the true divine. As for why this was more likely, first of all, it was because the simulated chaotic state was originally derived from Luo Fan's 7th catastrophes. Since it was derived from his 7th catastrophes, the power of the simulated chaotic state should be limited to the level of the 7th catastrophe. The level of the 7th catastrophes was obviously at the level of the 7th catastrophes in this world. Therefore, any world in the simulated chaotic state could at most trigger the 7th catastrophes. Once it passed the 7th catastrophes, it would be completely perfect, and from then on, there would be no more catastrophes. This made sense. In fact, it was quite logical. Based on this point alone, Luo Fan was already leaning towards this world. Normally, it would only pass the 7th catastrophes. If one were to combine this with the fact that billions of trillions of years of peace had passed before the 8th great tribulation of the heavens and earth, and even gave off the feeling that it had been an eternity of peace and stability, was there a need to say more about which was more likely? It's a pity that it actually courted its own death and led the catastrophes to descend. Luo Fan could not help but smile bitterly. Of course, although there was a hint of helplessness in his words, he actually rather admired the creator of this world. After passing billions of trillions of years without catastrophes, in the end, it was still able to take the initiative to guide the catastrophes to descend when the opportunity arrived. It was to pursue further, to pursue the improvement of its own world. No matter what, such determination and pursuit was something worthy of admiration. The core is empty, but it's completely undamaged. The creator of this world has clearly escaped safely. To be able to escape from that kind of catastrophes, it's really quite extraordinary. Recalling the gap in the core that he had seen in the core of this world, Luo Fan could not help but exclaim in admiration again. The stronger the catastrophes, the more difficult it was to escape safely. There was no doubt about this. Based on the situation of the eighth great tribulation of the heavens and earth that this world had encountered, the terrifying tribulation that had even completely drowned the entire world and caused everything in this world to be assimilated by the power of the tribulation. Just thinking about it made his hair stand on end. Even his world of laws would not be able to last a few breaths in the face of such a catastrophes. However, it was such a terrifying catastrophes that the creator of this world had actually escaped unscathed. No matter how one looked at it, this situation was an unbelievable achievement. In fact, this could even make Luo Fan take back his original evaluation of him for courting death. Attracting endless catastrophes and ultimately being dragged into the abyss by the catastrophes was simply courting death. However, attracting endless catastrophes and ultimately escaping unscathed was no longer courting death. Instead, he had great foresight and dared to take risks. And now, the creator of this world was clearly worthy of the second evaluation. As his senses changed, Luo Fan began to become more and more interested in the creator of this world. However, it was clear that the creator of this world no longer existed in this world. No matter how interested he was, it was impossible for him to meet the creator of this world again. Therefore, at this time, Luo Fan could only regretfully put this interest aside for now. Perfection. After understanding that the second possibility was more likely, Luo Fan also vaguely understood why this world would attract the interest of the power related to the true divine. In terms of size, this world was still far from being comparable to the world of tribulations. In terms of the exquisiteness of the structure of the world, the complexity of the laws, and even the complexity of the great Tao, it was still inferior to the world of tribulations. If there were other reasons, then the power related to the true divine should have shifted its target to the world of tribulations. However, it was clear that the power related to the true divine did not do so. For billions of years, the world of tribulations had always existed in the tribulation layer, and that power had turned a blind eye to it. Even the so-called heavens that acted as the world of tribulations were only the actions of the living beings in the world of tribulations, and it was not something that the power actively guided. As soon as this world appeared in the tribulation layer, the power related to the true divine made a decision in an instant and instantly shifted from the depths of the tribulation layer to the core of this world. This was enough to show how great the difference in value was in the eyes of that power. Chapter 28-21. This kind of perfection was not just a feeling. It was a characteristic that this simulated chaotic state gave to this world, or rather, it gave this world some kind of authority. It could be said that if this place was not a simulated chaotic state but a real chaotic state, the situation might be different. For the real chaotic state, even the great world was not the limit of the world that it could withstand. In such a place, the perfect world might also have this kind of perfection and could obtain this kind of perfection. However, this kind of perfection might just be a feeling. It was no different from what Luo Fan originally understood about perfection. After all, to the true primal chaos, the perfect beauty of the world would undergo a tremendous leap after passing through a great tribulation. It could instantly become countless times more powerful than it was before. Just like that, the world would continue to descend again and again, and the world would also improve again and again. If it continued to improve like this, then at a certain moment, when the world had passed through the ninth world calamity but had yet to become a great world, the perfect world would naturally give off this kind of charm of perfection. Of course, for the real chaotic state's calamity mechanism, this was obviously a very short process between the ninth world calamity and the great world, and it might even be a process that passed in a flash. However, no matter what, this state would definitely exist. After all, the perfect world would not transform into a great world in an instant, nor would it start after passing through the ninth world calamity. There would definitely be a short period of time between this world calamity and the true transformation into a great world, and the world would be in the state of perfection after passing through the 9 world calamities. That state was very similar to the state of the perfect world that had passed through the 7 world calamities in the simulated chaotic state at this moment. However, in comparison, the perfect world that had passed through the 7 world calamities in the simulated chaotic state was actually just an additional state of the simulated chaotic state. It was because the simulated chaotic state simulated the limits of the real chaotic state, and it had no choice but to add a kind of state to the world that had passed through the 7 world calamities. However, the real chaotic state was different. For the real chaotic state, no matter how powerful the perfect world was, it could not reach the limit that it could withstand. Under such circumstances, the perfect state that the world was in after going through the 9 world tribulations was not a state that was forcibly added to the chaotic state. Instead, it was a state that the world had naturally reached after going through the world tribulations one after another. It was a state that was brewing towards the great heaven and earth, a state that was charging towards the great heaven and earth. It could be said that this kind of state was just a feeling that was naturally emitted from the process of the world being on the verge of being destroyed. Of course, that kind of perfection was actually quite similar to the perfection of the perfect world in the simulated chaotic state. There were 2 completely different conditions for the feeling to be emitted naturally and for the status to be forcefully attached. However, this did not mean that there were many differences between the 2 types of perfection. The perfect state of the perfect heaven and earth that had gone through the 9 great tribulations of the world also had the similar nature of the perfect world that was in the simulated chaotic state at this moment. After all, after going through the 9 great world tribulations, the perfect heaven and earth would naturally possess the characteristics of perfection. However, in the simulated chaotic state, because the number of times that the world had gone through the great heaven and earth was insufficient, the number of times that its essence had been enhanced and sublimated was insufficient. Therefore, it could not possess the characteristics of perfection by relying on its own characteristic. That was why the simulated chaotic state had to forcibly add the characteristics of perfection to it in a more accurate way. The perfect world that had gone through the 7 great heaven and earth in the simulated chaotic state was actually just a simulation of the perfect world that had gone through the great heaven and earth in the real chaotic state. That's right, it was just a simulation. This kind of perfect state was just a simulation of the perfect world that had gone through the 9 great heaven and earth. This kind of situation made one feel very helpless. However, it was obvious that this state was enough for the world that had gone through the 7 great heaven and earth to obtain an unbelievable improvement, making the nature of this world much more advanced than the world that had gone through the 9 great heaven and earth normally. After all, compared to the 7 great heaven and earth and the stock market, the 9 great heaven and earth had improved by many times. Without the 2 sublimations, the difference between the world that had gone through the 7 great heaven and earth and the world that had gone through the 9 great heaven and earth was as huge as the distance between heaven and earth. It could be said that the simulation of the state of the world that had gone through the 9 great heaven and earth had already improved the nature of the world that had gone through the 2 great heaven and earth, causing the world to become many times more advanced than before. Obviously, for the power that was related to the true divine, this kind of improvement, this kind of sublimation, and this kind of simulation of true perfection were what interested it. As for why this power did not go to the perfect world before, but waited for the perfect world to be pulled into the great heaven and earth before appearing here, the fundamental reason was obviously because there was no creator of the world. Although this power that was related to the true divine was powerful, it obviously did not have its own consciousness. In other words, it did not have the consciousness of a living being that Luo Fan could understand. Under such circumstances, it was clear that this force would not directly fight against living beings, nor would it directly fight against the creator of the world. It was even to the extent that even if he wanted to absorb some nutrients, energy, and materials from the world, He could only rely on the world itself and the living beings in the world to offer sacrifices on their own. Under such circumstances, it was obviously unlikely for it to take the initiative to snatch the world where the creator of the world existed. Of course, perhaps there was a certain relationship between the great heaven and the world outside the great heaven and earth. Regardless, when the perfect world was pulled into the great heaven and earth and assimilated by the boundless power of the great heaven and earth, the situation was obviously completely different. At this moment, this perfect world had completely lost its owner, and it had almost become as ordinary as any other place in the great heaven and earth. Under such circumstances, this power that was related to the true divine could naturally enter and leave as it pleased. Moreover, there was no gap between them at all, so it was much easier and more convenient for it to enter. After various thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, he let out a long sigh of relief. What a wonderful world! I didn't expect it to be able to simulate such a perfect world. Such a thought flashed through his mind. At this moment, the living being that was being interrogated by him looked at him carefully and was extremely anxious. He was naturally not anxious because he was in Luo Fan's hands and could be smashed to pieces by Luo Fan at any time. Instead, he was anxious because his connection with the outside world had been completely cut off. He did not know how worried the other people in the city would be, nor did he know what actions they would take because of this. At the thought of the consequences, he could not help but shudder. This city had already encountered an irresistible disaster. At this moment, with the efforts of the living beings, it barely recovered and reluctantly embarked on the path of growth. Under such circumstances, it could be said that he and the other people in this city were advancing towards the same goal and fighting for the same goal. Needless to say, the relationship between them was naturally very close. He believed that if the other powerhouses in this city discovered that something had happened to him, they would definitely take various actions to rescue him. It was just like how he would make the same choice if he discovered that others were in danger. What he was afraid of at the moment was their rescue operation. He was not worried that he would be accidentally injured by their rescue operation, nor was he worried that their rescue operation would cause the powerhouse before him to attack him. What he was worried about was that the powerhouse before him would be enraged by their rescue operation and attack the powerhouses who had rescued him. After interacting with this powerhouse for a few days, the living being knew very well how powerful this powerhouse was. Even if he didn't know how powerful he was, he clearly knew that he, or even all the powerhouses in the entire city, couldn't compare to a single finger of Lin Yun's. In other words, if all the powerhouses in this city joined forces and attacked this powerhouse, all he needed to do was lift a finger to deal with them. Under such circumstances, if this powerhouse attacked its companions, it believed that none of its companions would be able to survive. Faced with such a situation, how could the living being not be worried? "Senior, do you have any other instructions? If not, I plan to inform my companions." After a long while, the living being mustered his courage and spoke to Luo Fan carefully. Even if this sentence might anger Luo Fan, he still went all out. After all, if this sentence angered Luo Fan, he might be the only one who would die. However, if he did not ask this question, then all the powerhouses in this city might die. It could be said that by saying this at this moment, he had already disregarded his own life and death. It was precisely because he needed the courage to ask this question that he waited until now to ask it. After all, the courage required to disregard life and death was not something that could be easily inspired. Although the living being cared about the other powerhouses and thought that he was willing to take risks for the safety of other powerhouses, it was evident that risking his own life required too much mental preparation. If it was not for the fact that time was running out and the other powerhouses might have realized that something was wrong and taken action, he might not have been able to muster his courage. At this time, Luo Fan just smiled faintly and said, "I thought you would ask me this question from the beginning." The living being could not help but blush. "Don't worry, I'm not interested in your lives at all. All I need is the secrets of this world. Luo Fan smiled faintly and said. He did not know what the living being was thinking, nor did he try to find out. However, once the living being asked this question, he immediately grasped its thoughts and knew what it was worried about. All of the other party's thoughts had already been seen through by him without missing a single detail. At this moment, he seemed to be mocking, but he was actually quite impressed. After all, the living being was worried that the other living beings would encounter a disaster because they tried to save him. In order to avoid this, he risked his life. This was a positive approach no matter what. Such a positive approach was naturally worthy of praise. More importantly, at this moment, the other powerhouses in the entire city were indeed preparing to take action, just like what the living being had thought. They were preparing to attack this location, and were trying their best to find out what was happening in this location. From a certain aspect, they did not let down the trust of the living being before them. Both sides did not let each other down. This situation was naturally worthy of praise. Contact them. They're almost rushing in now. Luo Fan smiled faintly. As he spoke, he turned around and disappeared without a trace in a flash, as if he had never been there. The entire process was like the rising and setting of the sun, the flowing of water, the death of a person at birth, and so on and so forth. This made the living being feel a mysterious aura that was completely different from what it had comprehended in the past. Could it be that everything that happened just now was just my imagination? At this moment, it could not help but have such doubts in its heart. After all, the only thing that could prove Luo Fan's existence was its memory. Apart from its memory, everything else, be it the remnant aura in this room, the remnant power from before, or even the afterimages of time and space, could not prove this at all. Under such circumstances, how could it not have such doubts? However, it was ultimately not a foolish person. It quickly ascertained that it was not hallucinating. There was indeed a terrifying expert who had appeared in this place and had interrogated it for a couple of days.